The woman behind the counter had flour on her apron and a bruise on her heart that never quite healed right. Everyone in Red Ash Ridge knew Beatrice Hollow. They knew her the way they knew the old wagon rut on the main road. Something you stepped around without thinking, something that had simply always been there. She ran the general store her father had left her, kept accurate books, extended credit to families who couldn't pay, and remembered every child's birthday with a piece of hard candy slipped quietly across the counter. She did all of this without being asked and without being thanked, because that was simply who she was. What they also knew, what they never let her forget, was that she was fat. Not plump, not full-figured. The people of Red Ash Ridge were not generous with their language when it came to Beatrice Hollow. Fat, heavy, a big woman. These were the polite versions, the ones spoken in her presence, just loud enough to carry. There were worse ones for when she wasn't in the room, or when someone thought she couldn't hear through the thin walls separating the store from the back stockroom, where she sometimes sat eating her lunch alone rather than endure the dining room at the boarding house. She was 42 years old. She had never been courted. She had stopped expecting it sometime around 35 and had made a kind of peace with that fact, the kind of peace that isn't peace at all, but simply exhaustion wearing a quieter face. On the morning that changed everything, she was stacking tins of black-eyed peas when the door opened hard enough to bang the wall. Nora Pitsley came in first. That was how you always knew something was about to happen in Red Ash Ridge. Nora Pitsley arrived first, already talking, her voice preceding her like a storm front moving through a valley. "Did you hear?" she announced to the store at large, though the only people present were Beatrice behind the counter and old Amos Greer dozing on the bench by the stove. "Silas Mercer is back." Beatrice set down a tin carefully. Silas Mercer. She knew the name. Everyone did. He was one of the few people in the territory who made the mountains feel small by comparison. A trapper and tracker who had been working the high country for the better part of 15 years. A man who came down into town twice a year at most, bought his supplies without conversation, and went back up again like a man returning to his natural element. He was not unfriendly exactly. He was simply somewhere else in his head, even when he was standing in front of you. He was also, as Nora Pitsley would have told you without prompting, a widower. His wife Clara had died 3 years back. Fever. He'd buried her up on the mountain and hadn't come down for 4 months after, and when he finally did come into town, something had shifted in his face that hadn't shifted back since. "What of it?" Beatrice asked. "He's at the saloon," Nora said, lowering her voice to the pitch she used when she wanted everyone to hear her clearly. "And he's saying he needs a wife." Amos Greer opened one eye. "By tomorrow," Nora added, and let that sit. Beatrice didn't go to the saloon. She had not been inside the saloon in 11 years, since the night Jimmy Cook had stood up on a chair and announced to the room that betting on whether she'd break the floorboards was better entertainment than the piano player, and the room had laughed and she had walked out and kept walking until she reached the store and locked the door behind her, and sat in the dark for a long time. She didn't need to go to the saloon. Within 20 minutes, half the town came to her. They arrived in clusters, the way people do when there's news worth moving for. Ruth Farley and her daughter May. The Donahue brothers. Constance Webb, who ran the boarding house and considered herself the social authority of Red Ash Ridge by virtue of feeding most of it. They poured through the door of the general store and stood among the shelves of canned goods and bolts of fabric and bags of flour and talked over each other with the particular energy of people who have encountered something genuinely strange. "He walked in calm, as you please," Ruth Farley reported, sat down at the bar and said, and I heard this directly from Pete Alderson, who was there, said, "I need a wife, has to be settled before tomorrow morning." Just like that. Like he was ordering a bolt of rope. "Did he say why?" Beatrice asked. "His daughter," Constance Webb said, and the room changed slightly. "From Clara. The girl's been living with Clara's sister down in Millhaven since the burial, and apparently the sister is sick, real sick, and can't keep the child anymore. Child's coming up on the afternoon train tomorrow, and there's a county official riding with her who has the authority to place her directly into the orphanage in Glenfield if Mercer can't demonstrate a proper family situation." The word orphanage sat in the room like something dropped from a height. "How old is the girl?" Beatrice asked. 7, Ruth said. Name's Rosie. The conversation that followed was the kind Beatrice had grown accustomed to, the kind where she was present but not included. The women of Red Ash Ridge began talking among themselves about which unmarried woman might be willing to take on Silas Mercer and his complications, and they discussed it with the frank commercial energy of people assessing livestock at a fair. There was young Dorothy Marsh, but she'd been setting her cap at the new schoolteacher and wouldn't want to give that up. There was Ada Croft, but Ada had made clear she would not go up into those mountains under any circumstances. There was, what about Margaret Tilson? Someone offered. Margaret Tilson, Constance Webb said flatly, is engaged to a man in Sacramento and leaves on the Thursday coach. The list shortened itself rapidly, as lists do when examined closely. None of them looked at Beatrice. She continued stacking her tins. She was very good at not reacting to being overlooked. She'd had a great deal of practice. Silas Mercer walked into her store at 3:30 in the afternoon. She knew it was him before she looked up because of the particular way the door opened. Not the aggressive bang of Nora Pitsley making an entrance, but a careful, deliberate movement. A man who had learned to move through the world without wasting energy on unnecessary force. The bell above the door rang once and was silent. He was taller than she remembered. She had only seen him a handful of times over the years, always brief exchanges, supplies and payment, and no particular conversation. He had dark hair going gray at the temples, a face weathered to leather by years of high altitude and cold, and eyes that were a particular shade of gray-green she couldn't name precisely. He was not handsome in any conventional sense. He was something else, a man who looked exactly like what he was, without apology and without performance. He was carrying his hat in his hands. She noticed that. He had taken it off before entering. "Miss Hollow," he said. "Mr. Mercer." She set down the tin she was holding. "I expect you've been to most of the other establishments in town already." "I have," he said. There was no embarrassment in it. He stated it the way he might state that it had been a cold winter. "I heard you're a practical woman." She considered him steadily. "Who told you that?" "Pete Alderson." "Pete Alderson owes me $4.50 on credit he hasn't settled." Something moved in Silas Mercer's expression. It might have been the beginning of a smile. "He mentioned that too." Mishimad. He stood in the middle of her general store, among the hanging lanterns and the smell of coffee and sawdust and the specific closed warmth of a winter afternoon, and he told her about Rosie. He told it plainly, without ornamentation, the way a man tells a story he has already told himself too many times and is past the point of dramatizing. Rosie was 7. She had her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness and a laugh that had reportedly been big enough to fill a whole house before her mother died and the world changed on her. She had been living with her Aunt Margaret in Mill Haven, and it had been a decent arrangement, something that worked, until Margaret's illness had progressed past the point of her being able to manage a child on top of everything else. "The county man's name is Hargrove," Silas said. "He's coming on the train with Rosie tomorrow. His job is to assess the situation and make a determination. If I'm living alone up there with no family structure in place, he has the legal authority to redirect her to Glenfield." "And Glenfield's orphanage," Beatrice said. "Yes." "Have you been there?" "Once." He said it quietly. "To look. So I'd know what I was fighting." She didn't ask him what he'd seen. She didn't need to. The way he said it told her everything. "Mr. Mercer," she said carefully, "the women you've already approached. What reasons did they give?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Most of them said they wouldn't go up into the mountains. Some said they didn't know me well enough to make such a decision." A pause. "A few were more direct about the situation being beneath them." She understood what situation meant. A widower with a child, a rough cabin in the high country, a man who was away for months at a time, a life that was nothing like the softer version of frontier existence that women in town had managed to construct for themselves. It was an honest life, but it was not an easy one, and easy was what most people were angling for. "And what do you know about me?" she asked. He met her eyes directly. That directness was something. It was not common. Most people, when they looked at Beatrice Hollow, looked away quickly, as if her face contained something uncomfortable that they preferred not to hold in their gaze too long. "I know you've run this store alone for 12 years, he said. "I know you kept it from going under when the drought hit and half the town couldn't pay their accounts. I know 3 different families told me in the last 2 hours that they would have gone hungry winters ago if you hadn't extended credit without being asked." He paused. "And I know you're not married, and that you've—" He stopped. "That I've been overlooked," she said, not unkindly. He nodded once. There was something almost painful in the nod, like a man acknowledging a wrong he didn't commit, but understands he benefits from. Atar. What happened next was not something Beatrice had planned. She had been listening to him, genuinely listening, in the way she'd learned to listen over years of running a store, of hearing what people actually needed underneath what they were asking for. And a question had formed itself in her mind so cleanly that it arrived on her tongue before she had decided to say it. "What is your daughter's favorite color?" The silence that followed lasted long enough that she heard the wind shift against the front window. Silas Mercer stared at her. Not the dismissive kind of stare she was accustomed to. Something more complicated. Like a man who has walked a long way expecting a particular kind of terrain and suddenly found himself looking at something entirely different. He stopped. His jaw tightened slightly, and she saw it. The flash of something raw and honest crossing his face. "I don't know," he said. His voice had changed, just slightly. The flatness of it had cracked somewhere around the edges. "I don't know what her favorite color is," he said again, and this time there was something underneath the words that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite shame, but lived somewhere in the territory between them. Beatrice looked at him for a moment, then she said, "That's what I thought." "What does that mean?" "It means you're not asking me to be your wife," she said. "You're asking me to be her mother. And those are 2 very different things, and the second one matters a great deal more than the first." He didn't answer right away. She hadn't expected him to. She pulled a bolt of yellow fabric from under the counter set. She'd been planning to cut it for Mrs. Alderson's curtain order, and set it aside. Her hands needed something to do. They usually did when she was thinking clearly. "What would you need," she asked, "for this to be a real arrangement? Not the kind that looks right for a county official, the actual kind." Silas set his hat down on the counter. He ran a hand over his face, and in that gesture she saw the exhaustion he'd been carrying. Not just the last few days of this crisis, but years of it. Years of being alone up on that mountain, with nothing but his work and his grief, and the specific silence of a house that used to have a woman in it. "I don't know that I have anything to offer a woman who deserves better than a rough cabin and a broken schedule," he said. "I've been honest about that to every woman I've spoken to today. I won't pretend I have more than I do." "What do you have?" He thought about it seriously. She appreciated that he didn't rush it. "Land," he said. 40 acres, clear title. The cabin is solid. I built it myself, nothing fancy, but it stands. I trap well. We don't go hungry and we don't go cold. I keep my word when I give it." He paused. I'm not an easy man to live with, I know that. I go quiet for long stretches. I spend weeks in the high country. Clara." He stopped on the name, and she watched him push through it. "Clara used to say I was more comfortable with trees than people, and she wasn't wrong. And what would you need from me?" He looked at her. "A real home for Rosie. Stability. Someone who would make her feel like she belongs somewhere, because right now she doesn't feel that. She's been passed through 2 houses since her mother died, and she's 7 years old, and I don't know what her favorite color is, and He stopped again, pressed his lips together. "I need her to have a mother," he said. His voice was low and even and absolutely certain. Not a performance of one, a real one. Beatrice was quiet for a long moment. Through the front window, she could see the main street of Red Ash Ridge going about its late afternoon business, a horse being led past, 2 men in conversation by the livery, a child running with something clutched in both hands. She thought about things that she had not thought about in a long time, because thinking about them hadn't served any purpose. She thought about the school she had once dreamed of opening, back when she was young enough to believe that dreaming led somewhere. She thought about the night she had walked out of the saloon. She thought about the particular loneliness of being in a room full of people and being invisible to all of them. She thought about a 7-year-old girl on a train right now, watching the mountains get closer through a window, carrying a small suitcase, and every loss a child can carry. "I have 3 conditions," she said. Silas Mercer straightened slightly. "Tell me." "You never lie to her," Beatrice said. "Not to protect yourself, not to make things easier. If she asks something hard, you answer it as honestly as a man can, and you sit with her in the discomfort of the truth. Children know when they're being managed. It destroys trust faster than any honest, hard thing would." He nodded slowly. "Agreed." "You never let shame replace love. She's going to test you. She's lost her mother, and she doesn't trust the world to stay yet, and she's going to push at you to see if you go away too. You don't go away. Whatever she does, whatever she says, you stay, and you love her through it." His jaw was tight, but he nodded again. "And you never judge people by their appearance in front of her," Beatrice said. "Not ever. Not casually. Not as a joke. Not for any reason. Because children learn from what they see, and I will not have her grow up believing that the size of a person tells you anything about the size of their heart." The last condition sat between them. He understood it. She could see that he understood it. All of it. Everything she hadn't said directly. She watched him absorb it without flinching. "Those aren't conditions," he said finally. "Those are promises I should have been keeping already." "Yes," she said, "they are." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that forms when 2 people have just said something true, and the truth needs a moment to settle before anything else can happen. Silas Mercer picked up his hat. He turned it in his hands once, the way a man does when he's thinking about what to say next and is being careful about it. "Miss Hollow," he said, "I'm not going to tell you this is anything other than what it is. I'm not going to promise you romance or things I don't know if I can deliver. I'm asking you to step into something hard alongside a man you barely know for a child you've never met, in a place that is nothing like what you're used to." "I know that," she said. "Then why are you considering it?" She looked at him for a long moment. This was the honest version of the answer, the one that lived underneath the practical layers. "Because someone asked me today what your daughter's favorite color was," she said, "and I realized that the question mattered, and I'm not sure anyone else who walked through that door today would have asked it." She paused. "And because I've spent a long time being invisible, and I think your little girl has too, and I don't want that for her." Okay. He left the store 20 minutes later with a clear answer. She closed early for the first time in 11 years, flipped the sign in the window, and sat down at the small table in the back room where she ate her lunches alone. She did not feel triumphant. She did not feel afraid exactly, though something very close to fear was present. The particular fear of having committed to something real after a long time of committing to nothing at all. She thought about what needed to happen before tomorrow morning. She had to speak to her neighbor, old Edna Marsh, about managing the store for a few days. She had supplies to gather, food for a child, things a 7-year-old might want to find when she arrived somewhere new. She tried to remember what she had loved at 7. Yellow. She had loved yellow, as it happened. The color of sunlight through a clean window, the color of something warm and safe. She pulled out a length of yellow cotton from the same bolt she'd set aside for Mrs. Alderson's curtains. Mrs. Alderson could wait. But the news moved through Red Ash Ridge the way all news moved through Red Ash Ridge, instantly and with editorial additions that had no basis in fact. By supper time, Beatrice had heard 3 versions of her own decision, each more elaborate than the last. Nora Pitsley found her on her way home. "Is it true?" Nora demanded, falling into step beside her in that aggressive sidewalk way she had. "You told Silas Mercer yes?" "I did." "Beatrice," Nora's voice dropped into something that wanted to be concern but was mostly shock badly disguised. "He'll be gone months at a time in those mountains. You'll be up there alone with a child you don't know. You've never even—" She stopped herself from saying whatever she'd been about to say. "Never even what?" Beatrice asked pleasantly. Nora collected herself. "It's a hard life." "Yes," Beatrice agreed, Most lives are. People are going to talk. People have always talked, Beatrice said. I'm still here. Nora had more to say. She could see it organized behind the woman's eyes, all the social assessments and the practical objections and the specific kind of pity that wears the clothing of friendship. But she must have found something in Beatrice's face that stopped her, because she pressed her lips together and simply said, "Well, I suppose you know your own mind." "I do," Beatrice said. "That's something, isn't it?" She was up before dawn the next morning. Silas arrived at the store at first light. He'd come down from wherever he'd been staying, the boarding house probably, and he looked like a man who had not slept much, which put them on equal footing. He was wearing his best coat. She noticed this with something that wasn't quite tenderness, but lived next to it. "You're sure?" he said. It was not quite a question. "I don't make decisions I'm not sure of," she told him. He nodded. "Neither do I, as a rule." "Then we understand each other." She had a bag packed. Yellow fabric, a book of illustrated stories she'd found in the back of the store's inventory, a jar of apple butter she'd put up in October, a small wooden puzzle she'd carried in stock for 3 years and never sold. Enough food for several days. He looked at the bag. "You've been up all night." "Part of it," she admitted. He was quiet for a moment. Then, with the same careful directness he seemed to bring to everything, "I want you to know that I'm going to try to be worth the trust you're putting into this arrangement." It was not a declaration of love. It was not a promise of happiness or romance or any of the things that people usually attach to the institution of marriage. It was something plainer and possibly more durable, a man telling a woman that he understood the weight of what she was doing and intended to take it seriously. "Thank you," she said. The wedding happened at sunrise. The justice of the peace, a man named Calvin Rudd, who had married 17 couples in Red Ash Ridge and buried half of them, arrived at 7 o'clock with sleep still in his eyes and went through the ceremony with efficient brevity. The witnesses were old Amos Greer, who had woken up for the occasion, and Edna Marsh, who cried through all of it without explaining why. Constance Webb had reportedly wanted to attend but had not been invited. It was cold. The sun was coming up over the eastern ridge and turning everything copper and pale gold. Beatrice stood in her good gray dress with flour on her hands, because she'd been baking bread at 5 in the morning and hadn't fully scrubbed it off. And Silas stood beside her in his best coat and said the words when Calvin Rudd told him to say them, and looked at her directly the whole time. When Calvin Rudd said he could kiss the bride, there was a pause. The specific pause of two strangers who have just made an enormous decision and are navigating the immediate practical awkwardness of it. Then Silas Mercer leaned forward and pressed his lips to her cheek, just below the temple, briefly and without fanfare. "Well," said Amos Greer, as if that concluded a business transaction. "Yes," Beatrice agreed. They had 4 hours before the afternoon train. She spent them at the cabin, or rather, she spent them finding out what the cabin actually was, which was not what she had expected. She had expected rough. She had not expected the particular rough of a man who was precise and careful and built things to last. The cabin was solid, as he'd promised. The woodwork was clean. There was good light through the windows he'd positioned with some care for how the sun moved. What there was not was much of anything for a child. She looked around at the spare walls and the efficient, functional arrangement of everything, a place built for survival, for work, for solitary existence. And she understood what needed to happen in the time they had. Silas moved furniture. She directed, because she had a clearer picture of what a child needed and wasn't too proud to say so. The second room, smaller, tucked at the back, she claimed for Rosie. He built a wooden frame and strung it with rope for a mattress. She covered it with the quilt she'd brought, the yellow fabric she'd cut in the early morning hours, and edged with what she had. "She may not even like yellow," Silas said, looking at it. "She may not," Beatrice agreed. "But it was my favorite at 7, and 7-year-olds who have lost a great deal deserve at least one thing that is the color of warmth." He was quiet, and then he said, "Where do you want the shelf?" She pointed. He built it in 40 minutes, freehand, with the specific economy of a man who has built many things alone. She lined it with the book, the puzzle, a small tin cup she'd painted with a border of red berries on the walk up, because she had a good eye for small things, and she'd wanted there to be small beauty in the room. When it was done, she stood in the doorway and looked at it. It was imperfect. The shelf was slightly uneven. The quilt was not her best work. The cup was a plain tin cup with some paint on it. But the room felt different than it had when they'd walked in. It felt like somewhere a child might feel that she'd been thought about. That was what mattered. They left for the station at 2 o'clock. On the road down, they walked mostly in silence, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. Beatrice was aware of Silas beside her. The specific way he moved, the particular attentiveness of a man who has spent years in the wilderness and never fully switched off the part of his brain that is watching and measuring the environment. She was aware, too, of the specific strangeness of the day. She had woken up that morning a woman alone. She would go to sleep that night married. She would go to sleep that night with a child in the cabin. It was not the life she had imagined for herself. She had stopped imagining a life a long time ago. But as she walked down the mountain road with this quiet, difficult, serious man beside her, with the late afternoon light coming through the pine trees and the smell of cold air and snow higher up on the ridge, she felt something she had not felt in a long time. Not happiness. Not yet. That was too large a word for a single day. But possibility. The specific aliveness of a door opening onto a room you haven't seen yet. The station at Red Ash Ridge was small. A platform, a water tower, a waiting area with 4 wooden benches, and a potbelly stove that someone kept inadequately fueled. A handful of people were waiting for the afternoon train, some of them people she knew. And she was aware of their awareness of her, of Silas beside her, of the specific loaded nature of their presence together in this public place. She didn't look at any of them. She looked at the tracks going south toward the lower country and the rest of the world. The train was on time. She heard it before she saw it. The low rumble that built itself slowly into something enormous. And then it was there, sliding into the station with the particular authority of machines that move through the landscape without asking its permission. People got off. A man with a traveling case, a woman with a bandbox, a family, tired-looking, with too much luggage. And then a small girl, 7 years old, dark-haired like her father, thin in the way of children who have not eaten well for a period of time, or who have eaten well enough but have not been happy. She was wearing a blue coat that had been let out at the sleeves recently, and she carried a small leather suitcase that looked disproportionately large for her size, and she stepped off the train onto the platform and stood very still, looking around with the particular careful expression of a child who has learned not to show too much too soon. Beside her was a man in a county official's coat, Hargrove, Beatrice assumed, who was holding a folder of papers and scanning the platform with the specific energy of a bureaucrat who has been on a long train and wants to complete his assignment efficiently. Rosie found her father first. She looked at him for a long moment without moving. Her face did not change exactly, but something moved through it, the way wind moves through long grass, changing the surface without changing what's underneath. Silas Mercer crossed the platform to his daughter and crouched down in front of her. And Beatrice watched him do it, watched him put himself at eye level with this small girl he had failed in all the ways a grieving man fails, and say something quiet that she couldn't hear. Rosie's chin trembled. She stopped it. She was 7 years old, and she had already learned to stop her chin from trembling. It was the most heartbreaking thing Beatrice had seen in years. Then the girl looked past her father, looked directly at Beatrice. She studied her with the frank, unfiltered assessment that only children and certain wild animals are capable of. No politeness, no social overlay, just pure evaluative attention. And then she said it. "Why would someone like her want me?" Her voice was small and clear and absolutely serious. The people nearby, not many, but enough, heard it. Beatrice felt them hearing it, felt the specific atmospheric shift of a question that has just made a room uncomfortable. She did not feel hurt. She understood the question. She understood it from the inside out, having spent 4 decades in a world that had asked versions of it about her. Why would someone like that expect to be wanted, to be seen, to be anything other than what she appeared to be on the surface? She walked forward. She walked past Silas, who had straightened and was looking at her with something complicated in his expression, and she stopped in front of Rosie and she went down. Not graceful, Her knees were not what they'd been, and the platform was cold, and it took her a moment to settle. But she went down, and she looked at the girl directly. "Because," she said quietly, "lonely hearts recognize each other long before beautiful faces do." Rosie stared at her. Her lower lip moved. The careful stillness of her face cracked at the edges, and beneath it was everything: the grief and the fear and the longing that a 7-year-old should not have to carry. And she held all of it for one more second, two, and then she let out a sound that was not quite crying yet, and stepped forward and put her small arms around Beatrice's neck. Beatrice held her. On the platform of the Red Ash Ridge station, in the cold of a late winter afternoon, with Silas Mercer standing behind them and a county official with a folder of papers looking on, and the last of the day's light going copper through the pine trees at the edge of town, Beatrice held this child she had known for 30 seconds, and felt something shift inside her chest that she didn't have a name for yet. She thought she might find one eventually. She held on. Rosie didn't let go for a long time. That was the first thing Beatrice learned about her. She held on. Not the brief, polite hug of a child performing gratitude for adults watching, but the grip of someone who had been in open water long enough that solid ground felt like something to be tested before trusting. Her small arms stayed locked around Beatrice's neck, while the cold pressed in from the platform, and the county official cleared his throat once, then thought better of repeating it. Silas stood behind them. Beatrice could feel him there without looking. The specific stillness of a man who doesn't know what to do with his hands when emotion moves through a situation faster than practicality can manage it. She heard him shift his weight. She heard him decide not to speak. Smart man, she thought. When Rosie finally pulled back, she didn't go far. She kept one hand loosely in Beatrice's coat sleeve, like someone keeping a finger in a book so they don't lose the page. She looked at Beatrice's face with that same direct, uncurated attention from before, taking inventory, measuring something that didn't have a name yet. "Your hands are cold," the girl said. "It's a cold day," Beatrice said. "Mine are too." Rosie considered this. "We could share a pocket." It was such a practical, unsentimental solution that Beatrice almost laughed. She didn't, because something told her that laughter right now might frighten the thing that was beginning to form between them. Too sudden, too large. Instead, she opened the right pocket of her coat, and Rosie put her hand in alongside Beatrice's, and they stood like that while Silas went to speak with Hargrove. The county official was a thin man with a neat mustache, and the particular manner of someone who has seen too many hard situations and has responded by building a professional distance between himself and all of them. He went through his papers with Silas on the far end of the platform, speaking in a low, efficient voice, and Beatrice watched without appearing to watch. She could read the shape of the conversation from the body language alone. Silas presenting the facts with the same flat directness he brought to everything. Hargrove asking questions and making notes, the occasional glance in her direction that Hargrove tried to make look casual and didn't quite manage. He was assessing her. She had expected that. "Is he deciding if you get to keep me?" Rosie asked. She asked it without distress, which was somehow worse than if she'd sounded frightened. The distress had been processed somewhere earlier in some quiet interior place, and what was left was this flat, watchful pragmatism. "He's deciding if your father and I can provide a good home," Beatrice said. "Is that the same thing?" "Yes," Beatrice said. "That's the same thing." Rosie was quiet for a moment. What if he says no? He won't. But what if he does? Beatrice looked at her. "Then your father and I will find another way, and another one after that, until we find one that works. That's what adults who are paying attention do." Rosie absorbed this with the serious consideration it deserved. "My Aunt Margaret tried," she said. "She just got too sick." "I know," Beatrice said. "That wasn't your fault and it wasn't hers. Some things just happen, and they're not anyone's fault." The girl was quiet again. Then, "She cried when I left." "I expect she did." "I didn't," Rosie said. And then, after a pause with something in it that wasn't quite shame but was related to it, "I wanted to." "Sometimes," Beatrice said carefully, "the crying has to wait until you're somewhere safe enough to let it happen." Rosie turned her head and looked at her directly. Something moved in her face, that same cracking at the edges she'd shown on the platform, but she held it again. Not suppression exactly, more like deliberate postponement. Okay, she said. Just that. Hargrove came over to them when he and Silas had finished. He looked at Beatrice with the specific appraising neutrality of a man whose job requires him to form rapid assessments of strangers and who has practiced enough at it to not let the assessment show too clearly. Mrs. Mercer, he said. He used the name without inflection, which told her he'd already noted it and moved on. Mr. Hargrove, you were married this morning. At sunrise, she said. The justice of the peace was Calvin Rudd. The witnesses were Amos Greer and Edna Marsh. I can provide their addresses if you need to verify. He looked at her steadily. She looked back. She had been looked at by people trying to find her wanting for 40 years. She was good at staying still under it. Your husband tells me you've run the general store in Red Ash Ridge for 12 years, he said. Independently, yes. And you're prepared to relocate to the Mercer property. I've already begun, she said. The child's room is ready. There's food in the cabin. If you want to come and see, you're welcome to. Hargrove glanced at Rosie, who was watching him with that same unnerving directness. He looked slightly uncomfortable under it, which told Beatrice that he was, at least, a man with some conscience operating underneath the professional manner. That won't be necessary, he said. I'll file the assessment as stable family situation, conditional on a follow-up review in 60 days. He looked at Silas. You understand the conditions of the review. I do, Silas said. Mrs. Mercer. Hargrove nodded to her once, the nod of a man who has formed an opinion he's keeping to himself, and turned and walked back toward the station building. Rosie watched him go. He's not very warm, she observed. No, Beatrice agreed, but he's fair, I think, and fair is often more useful than warm. Yeah. The road back up to the cabin was steep in places and the light was going. Silas carried Rosie's suitcase and Beatrice's bag, both without being asked. Rosie walked between them, and she didn't take Beatrice's pocket this time. She watched the road, the trees, the mountain coming out of the blue dusk above them, with the specific wide attention of a child encountering a landscape for the first time. Are there bears? She asked. Yes, Silas said. Have you ever seen one? Many times. Rosie considered this. Did they try to hurt you? Once. A sow with cubs. She made her feelings known. What did you do? Backed away slowly and let her know I wasn't a threat. And that worked? Eventually, Rosie walked for a few more steps. I think I would have run, she said. Running is the wrong instinct with bears, Silas said. It tells them you're prey. What if your instincts are wrong? He was quiet a moment, and Beatrice heard something deliberate in the pause. A man thinking about more than bears. Then you learn to override them, he said. It takes practice. Rosie glanced up at him sidelong. She didn't say anything else about bears. The cabin looked different with lamplight in the windows. Beatrice had banked the fire before they left, and the coals were still alive, and she rebuilt it quickly while Silas got the lamps lit, and Rosie stood in the middle of the main room and turned slowly, looking at everything. The ceiling, the shelves, the wood stove, the table with its two mismatched chairs, the deerskin by the hearth that had been there since before Clara died, and had the specific soft flatness of something very old and well used. It smells like pine, Rosie said. Pine and wood smoke, Beatrice agreed. You'll stop noticing it after a few days. I don't want to stop noticing it, she said it simply. It smells like outside, but inside. Beatrice thought about that. That's a good description of it, she said. She showed Rosie her room last. She made herself wait, let the girl settle slightly into the main space first. Let her feel the warmth of the fire and have a cup of warm milk that Silas heated without being asked. She noted that, filed it away, the specific attentiveness of a man who was trying hard even if he didn't know how to show it easily. When she finally opened the door to the back room and stepped aside, Rosie walked in slowly. She stood in the middle of the small space and looked at the yellow quilt, the shelf with the book and the puzzle and the painted tin cup, the wooden toys Silas had made, rough animals, a horse and a dog, and something that might have been a bear, sanded smooth but clearly handmade. She picked up the horse. She turned it in her hands. She looked at the shelf again, at the tin cup with its border of red berries. She ran one finger along the quilt without saying anything. Then she sat down on the edge of the bed, and the tears came. Not the careful, controlled kind. The other kind. The kind that has been waiting a long time for the right place to happen. She sat there with the small wooden horse in both hands and cried in the way that 7-year-olds cry when they have been holding everything in for too long, which is all the way and without apology and with the particular wrenching honesty of someone who has not yet learned to perform their grief for other people. Beatrice sat beside her. She didn't say anything. She put an arm around the girl's thin shoulders and let her cry. And after a moment, Rosie leaned into her side with the full weight of everything she'd been carrying, and Beatrice held it. Silas had followed them to the doorway. She could see him in the periphery, standing very still, his hands at his sides, watching his daughter cry with an expression on his face that was not quite grief and not quite relief, but something that lived between them. The face of a man who understands that the crying is necessary and doesn't know what to do with the necessity of it. He didn't try to stop it. She gave him credit for that. When it ran its course, when Rosie had cried herself to the other side of it and was sitting against Beatrice's side with the specific hollow quietness that comes after, she sniffled once and looked at the wooden horse still in her hands. "Did he make these?" she asked, meaning Silas. "Yes," Beatrice said. Rosie looked at the horse for a long moment. "He's not very good at it," she said. There was no cruelty in it, just honest assessment. From the doorway, Silas said, "I know." A pause. "I started making them about a month ago, first time I'd ever tried." Rosie looked at him. "Why did you start?" He was quiet for long enough that Beatrice wondered if he'd answer. Then, "Because I needed something to do with my hands while I was thinking about you coming." Rosie turned the horse over in her hands again. "I'll keep it," she said. "Okay," Silas said. "I'll keep all of them." "Okay." She set the horse carefully on the shelf beside the tin cup. She smoothed the edge of the yellow quilt with one hand. Then she looked up at Beatrice. "What's for supper?" Beatrice made biscuits and a bean soup with the salt pork she'd brought from the store, and Rosie sat at the table and watched with focused attention, the way children watch things they intend to learn. She asked questions, not the nervous, gap-filling questions of a child performing interest, but real ones. "How do you know when the biscuits are done? What does salt pork do to beans? Why do you stir it that way?" Beatrice answered each one directly. She didn't talk down or simplify. She treated the questions as what they were, serious inquiries from a person trying to understand the world. Silas sat at the table and said very little, but he listened. That was something Beatrice was beginning to understand about him. The silence was not absence. He was present in it, attending to everything, filing it all away in that careful internal place that seemed to be where he processed the world. "Do you cook?" Rosie asked him. "Some," Silas said. "Mostly trail food, things that don't require much." "Like what?" "Dried meat, cornmeal, beans cooked over a fire." He paused. "I make decent coffee." Rosie considered this. "Beatrice makes better food." "I know," Silas said. "You should watch her, the way I'm watching her." Something crossed his face, that almost smile again. "I'll do that," he said. After supper, when the dishes were done and the fire was burning low and steady, Rosie sat on the deerskin rug and looked through the book of illustrated stories. She didn't ask to be read to, which told Beatrice something. She was old enough to read herself and had the particular self-sufficiency of a child who had spent time without adults paying close attention to her. But she kept glancing up, not at the book, at both of them, at Silas whittling something at the table, at Beatrice mending a seam in the quilt border by the fire, checking, verifying, making sure they were still there. Beatrice knew what that was. She'd done it herself years ago, in the months after her father died, and the store became hers, and every morning she'd woken up and had to relearn that the life she'd known had changed shape permanently. She didn't draw attention to the checking. She just made sure to be findable when the glances happened. At some point, Rosie fell asleep on the rug with the book open across her chest, and Silas carried her to the back room with the careful competence of a man who had done this before, in another life, in the years before grief had reorganized everything, and came back without waking her. He sat back down at the table. Beatrice continued sewing. The fire crackled. Outside, the mountain wind had come up and was moving through the pines in that rhythmic, oceanic way that made the silence inside feel more solid. "She's going to test us," Beatrice said quietly. She wasn't looking up from the quilt. "She's been moved twice in 3 years, and she's waiting for it to happen again. She'll do things to see if we leave." Silas was quiet for a moment. "I know." "Do you?" "I know because I do the same thing," he said. "Just less obviously." She looked up at that. He was looking at the table, at his hands, at nothing in particular, the look of a man who has just said something more honest than he'd fully intended to say. She didn't push at it. "Okay," she said, "then you'll understand what you're watching when it happens." "Will you?" he asked. "Understand what you're watching?" She thought about it honestly. "I think so. I've spent a long time watching people and reading what's underneath the surface of what they show." She paused. "I haven't always done it perfectly." "No," he said. "Nobody does." The first week was harder than either of them said aloud. Rosie woke in the night on the second day, a sharp cry that brought both Beatrice and Silas to the doorway at the same time. She was sitting up in bed, eyes open, the wooden horse clenched in one hand, and for a moment she looked at them both without recognition, the particular blankness of someone caught between sleep and waking in a place that wasn't yet fully familiar. Then she focused, saw Beatrice. Something released in her face. She didn't say anything. She lay back down and pulled the yellow quilt up and closed her eyes, and within minutes she was breathing steadily again. Silas and Beatrice stood in the hallway and didn't speak. After a moment he went back to his room and she went back to hers, and neither of them mentioned it in the morning. They were two strangers sharing a house, navigating around each other with the careful courtesy of people who understand that proximity without familiarity requires deliberate effort. He made coffee at first light and left a cup on the table for her. She made breakfast. He tended the animals and the woodpile. She kept the fire and the food and the small internal management of the cabin that is mostly invisible until it isn't done. They didn't talk much. When they did, it was practical, necessary. He told her which supplies they were running low on. She told him what Rosie had eaten and what she'd refused. He reported on the condition of the trails. She mentioned that the roof was shedding snow unevenly over the north corner, and there might be an ice problem forming. He fixed the ice problem that afternoon without making anything of it. She noticed. On the fourth morning, Rosie announced at breakfast that she wanted to learn to make bread. "You're a little young to manage the kneading," Beatrice said. "How old were you when you learned?" "9, but my mother started teaching me when I was 6. "Then I'm old enough to start." There was a logic to it that was hard to argue with. Beatrice cleared the table and got out the flour and lard and the specific combination of things she'd been making bread with since she was old enough to reach the counter standing on a stool, and she showed Rosie each step with the deliberate patience she brought to teaching anything. Not oversimplifying, not rushing, answering the questions that came as they came. Rosie was not naturally tidy. She got flour on her coat and the floor, and at one point in her hair, and she persisted through the mess with a focused determination that was pure Silas, Beatrice thought, even if the girl didn't know it yet. The hands kneading the dough were too small and not quite strong enough, so the bread that came out of it was denser than it should have been, and when Rosie tasted it, she made a face. "It's not as good as yours," she said. "No," Beatrice agreed. "First bread never is." "When will mine be as good?" "When you've made enough of them." She paused. "Skill isn't something you get, it's something you accumulate. Every loaf you make gets added to the ones before it." Rosie considered the dense loaf with something that wasn't quite acceptance. "I'm going to make one every day until it's right," she said. "That'll mean a lot of bread," Beatrice said. "Then we'll need a lot of butter." Silas, who had come in from outside during this conversation and was standing with his coat still on and snow on his boots, said, "We've got a cow." Rosie looked at him. "You have a cow?" In the lower barn, doesn't produce much this time of year, but enough for butter if you're patient. Something lit in Rosie's face. Not quite a smile yet, but the precursor to one, the movement that happens in a face before it remembers it's allowed to be happy. Will you show me? She asked. And the asking was directed at him, not Beatrice. And Beatrice saw Silas register that fact with something that moved through him quietly. Tomorrow morning, he said. Early. How early? Before the sun clears the eastern ridge. Rosie nodded with the gravity of someone accepting a serious appointment. I'll be ready, she said. The gossip from town reached the cabin on the 7th day, carried up by Pete Alderson, who had a legitimate reason to come. He'd brought an order Beatrice had left behind, some thread and a bolt of cloth that Edna Marsh had set aside, and an illegitimate one, which was to see with his own eyes what the household situation actually looked like. She received him at the door without particular warmth. He handed over the package with the slightly self-conscious energy of a man who knows he's been caught doing something small and transparent. How are you settling in? He asked. Well enough, she said. Town's been talking, he offered. Town always is, she said. What are they saying? He had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. Some folks say it won't last. That Mercer will go back to the mountain in spring and leave you stuck up here with the kid. He paused. Some folks say other things. What other things? He looked at his boots. That he only married you because no one else would have him, and that you only said yes because no one else would have you. She let that sit for a moment, let it land and settle and find its place in the specific inventory of things people had said about her over the years. Pete, she said, do you have any opinion of your own, or do you mostly carry other people's? He blinked. I didn't say I believed it. You're repeating it, she said. That's close enough. She took the package. You still owe me $4.50. He dug in his coat pocket with the specific embarrassed urgency of a man who has walked into something he didn't expect. He produced $3 and some coins that came to approximately the right amount, and she counted it and gave him a receipt from the receipt book she kept in her apron pocket out of old habit and sent him back down the mountain. She stood in the doorway for a moment after he left. No one else would have him. No one else would have her. The two damaged quantities that added up to something useful. She thought about what Silas had said at the table in the firelight, about testing and leaving, about understanding it because he did it himself. She thought about what she'd understood for most of her adult life, that the world sorts people by their surfaces and makes assumptions about their depths, and that the assumptions are almost always wrong. She went inside and made lunch. It was Rosie who noticed the bruise first. Beatrice had caught the corner of the woodpile on her hip 3 days in the dark of early morning when she'd gotten up to stoke the fire. It was a significant bruise, the kind that surfaces in spectacular color over several days. And she hadn't thought anything of it, because bruises happened, especially in a new space where the geometry was still unfamiliar. She was reaching for something on the upper shelf when her shirt pulled up slightly, and Rosie, who was sitting at the table doing the letter practice Beatrice had set her, looked up and saw it. That's a big bruise, she said. Woodpile got me, Beatrice said. Does it hurt? Some. Rosie was quiet for a moment, then, my mama had bruises sometimes. She said it without particular inflection, which was somehow worse than if she'd said it with one. Beatrice turned from the shelf and looked at her carefully. What kind of bruises? Rosie shrugged in the elaborate way children do when they're trying to make something smaller than it is. From falling, she said. She wasn't very careful. Okay, Beatrice said, and she filed it in the careful place she kept for things that needed to be understood slowly, over time, without pushing. There would be a time for that conversation, and it was not now. What she said instead was, would you hand me the jar on the second shelf, the green one? What is it? Arnica, for bruises. She opened it. It smelled like something wild and faintly medicinal. Your grandmother's recipe, if you had a grandmother who knew plants. She didn't, actually. She'd learned it from a woman named Hester Bryce, who'd lived at the edge of town and been considered strange by people who didn't understand that strange often just meant knowledgeable. Rosie leaned over and sniffed it. It smells like the forest in summer. That's more or less what it is. Can I try it? Do you have a bruise? Rosie pushed up her sleeve and showed a small, yellow-green bruise on her forearm, faded and clearly a week old. "From the train," she said. "The luggage rack." Beatrice applied a careful amount with 2 fingers, and Rosie held very still, watching her hands with that inventory attention. "You know a lot of things," Rosie said. "Some things," Beatrice said. "Not enough. Nobody knows enough. My teacher in Millhaven said women only need to know cooking and sewing and keeping house." Beatrice looked at her. "What do you think of that?" Rosie considered it seriously. "I think she only knew cooking and sewing and keeping house," she said, and she seemed bored. Beatrice said. "What would you like to know?" The girl thought about it, really thought. You could see it, the actual internal sorting through possibilities. "Everything about plants," she said finally, "and how to read maps, and mathematics, and possibly how to track animals, but only so I can find them, not hurt them." "That's a reasonable list," Beatrice said. "Can you teach me?" "The plants, yes. The maps, somewhat. The mathematics, absolutely. I've been running accounts since I was 14. The tracking—" She paused. "You'll have to ask your father." Rosie glanced at the door. Outside, Silas was splitting wood. They could hear the regular crack of the axe. "Do you think he would?" "I think," Beatrice said carefully, "that your father has a lot of things he'd like to teach you and doesn't yet know how to begin." Rosie looked at the door for a moment longer. "Maybe I should begin it for him," she said. "Maybe you should," Beatrice said. She did. That afternoon, she went out to where Silas was splitting wood and stood watching him with her arms folded against the cold, and when he stopped and looked at her, she said, "Will you show me what tracks look like?" "In the snow. I want to know what made what." He looked at her for a moment. Something that was not quite surprise. He'd been trained out of easy surprise by years in the wilderness, but something adjacent to it. A recalibration. "Now?" he said, "unless you're busy." He set down the axe. "Come on then," he said, and walked toward the tree line. She followed him. From the cabin window, Beatrice watched them go. The tall man and the small girl moving through the snow at the edge of the pines. The girl's face tipped up toward him, his bent slightly down toward her. He stopped and crouched and pointed at something in the snow, and she crouched beside him, and Beatrice watched Rosie's hand come out and trace the shape of whatever track it was with one finger. She didn't know exactly what she was feeling, something in the category of things that work out when they're not supposed to, which is a category she'd had very little experience with. She went back to the bread. The second Sunday of their marriage, they drove the wagon into town for supplies. She had not been back to Red Ash Ridge since the wedding, and she was aware, with the particular hyper-awareness of someone who knows they're being watched, of the town assembling its opinion as the wagon rolled down the main street. She sat on the bench beside Silas with Rosie between them, and she looked straight ahead and kept her face neutral and her hands in her lap. The first person they passed was Nora Pitsley, who stopped on the boardwalk and stared with her mouth slightly open. Beatrice nodded to her. Nora nodded back, slowly, with the expression of a woman rapidly revising her expectations. At the general store, her general store, where Edna Marsh had been managing things in her absence, several people found reasons to be present at the same time. Old friends, neighbors, people who had known her for years and wanted to look at this new configuration of her life and see if they could read anything useful in it. She let them look. What they saw, she imagined, a large woman in a good coat sitting straight in a wagon beside a man most of them had written off as permanently solitary, with a small, dark-haired girl pressed against her side eating the piece of hard candy Beatrice had produced from her pocket somewhere on the road down. What they couldn't see, the bruise on her hip, the bread she'd made that morning that was still slightly too dense, the conversation the night before when she and Silas had sat at the table for 2 hours going over the 60-day review requirements, and she had said some things that were difficult to say, and he had listened with the particular quality of attention that was beginning to feel like its own kind of gift. Inside the store, Edna Marsh looked at her with bright eyes. "You look different," she said quietly, when the others were occupied. "I'm not different," Beatrice said. "You're a little different," Edna said. "Not worse, just different." She paused. "The child is beautiful." "She's 7 and opinionated and determined to make bread every day until it's right," Beatrice said. "I think that's more useful than beautiful." Edna smiled. A real one, without social overlay. Yes, she said. I think you're right. But it was on the way back up the mountain that things cracked slightly. Rosie had been quiet since they left town. A different quiet than her usual, considering quiet, the kind that Beatrice had learned to pay attention to. She sat between them on the wagon bench and looked at the road, and when they hit the stretch of steep climb that required the horse to work hard, she said, without preamble, "They were looking at you." "People look," Beatrice said. "Not the normal-looking kind." Rosie's voice was flat, and underneath the flatness was something with edges. "The kind like you're something strange." "I know what kind." "It's rude." "Yes," Beatrice said. "It is." "Why do they do it?" Beatrice thought about the honest answer. The easy answer was that people were afraid of things that didn't fit their expectations. The honest answer was messier than that, more about learned habit, about the way cruelty gets normalized until it feels like simple observation. "Some people," she said, "have decided that the way a person looks tells them everything they need to know. And when they see someone who doesn't fit what they expect, they don't know where to put them. So they stare or they say things, because it makes them feel like they understand what they're looking at." "But they don't understand," Rosie said. "No," Beatrice said. "They don't." "Then they should be quiet until they do." From Rosie's other side, Silas said, "That's about the clearest statement of it I've ever heard." Rosie looked up at him. He was looking at the road, handling the reins, but she looked at his profile for a long moment. "Did people stare at my mama?" she asked. The question landed in the wagon like something physical. Beatrice felt Silas absorb it, the specific stillness of a man hit by something he wasn't ready for. "Your mama," he said, after a moment, "was the kind of woman people stared at because she was beautiful, and she used to say that being stared at for that reason wasn't much better, because people still weren't looking at what mattered." Rosie was quiet for a moment. What did matter about her? His voice changed, just slightly. "She was funny," he said, and she remembered everything. Names, dates, what people had told her months before. She made people feel like they were worth remembering. A pause. "She was right that you'd find your way here." Rosie went very still. "She said that?" "Before she died," he said. She said that she hoped you'd find your way somewhere that felt right. She didn't know where it would be." He paused. "I think she'd say this was close to right." Rosie turned forward again. Beatrice felt the slight press of her shoulder as she leaned infinitesimally toward her father, and Beatrice shifted to make room for whatever this was. This small, hard-won movement between the two of them. This beginning of something that had been stopped up for 3 years and was only now, with some difficulty and some imperfect effort, starting to move again. The wagon went up the mountain, and the pines closed around them, and the light came through in the specific low gold of winter afternoon, and Beatrice looked at neither of them and let the moment be what it was. The bread got better on the 11th day. Rosie had been making a loaf every morning with the focused commitment of someone who has decided that a thing will be done and is not interested in negotiating with the difficulty of it. The first 3 had been dense enough to use as doorstops, and Beatrice had served them without comment and watched Rosie eat her own imperfect results with the specific grimness of someone holding themselves accountable. The 4th was better. The 5th was worse. She'd let the dough rest too long and it had gone slack. The 6th through 10th were a slow, uneven climb towards something edible, each one a small argument between the girl's determination and the particular alchemy of flour and heat that doesn't care about determination at all. The 11th loaf came out of the oven with a proper crust and a crumb that held together when you cut it, and Rosie stood at the table and looked at it for a long moment without touching it. "Well?" Beatrice said. Rosie cut a slice, ate it standing up, without butter, the way you test something seriously. "It's good," she said. She sounded almost surprised. "It is," Beatrice agreed. She'd tasted it. It was genuinely good. Not perfect, not the bread of someone who had been doing it for 30 years, but real bread, the kind that tasted like effort and intention. "Can we tell him?" Rosie asked. She meant Silas, who was outside checking the trap lines that ran along the lower ridge. "Go get him," Beatrice said. She went. Through the window, Beatrice watched her run across the snow toward the tree line, her dark hair loose from its braid and bouncing behind her, calling her father's name in a voice that was not the careful, measured voice of the girl who had stepped off the train 3 weeks ago. It was louder, less guarded, the voice of a child who has started to believe that being heard is permitted. Silas came in with snow on his shoulders and the particular alertness of a man pulled from work before he expected it, and Rosie pulled him to the table and pointed at the loaf with both hands as if presenting evidence. He looked at it. He looked at Beatrice. "Taste it," Rosie demanded. He cut a slice, chewed it carefully, with the same seriousness he brought to most things. "That's a good loaf," he said. Rosie stood straighter. "I made 11 before I got it right," she said. "Beatrice says skill accumulates." "Beatrice is right," he said. "I know," Rosie said simply. Beatrice turned back to the stove and said nothing. She was smiling at the wall where nobody had to see it. The 60-day review came on a Thursday. Hargrove arrived in the early afternoon, riding a good bay horse and carrying his same folder of papers, with the addition of a notebook that suggested he intended to be thorough. He was polite in the way of men who keep their personal opinions behind their professional ones, and he moved through the cabin with the practiced eye of someone who has assessed many households and knows the difference between the ones that have been staged for a visit and the ones that are simply lived in. This one was clearly lived in. The shelf in Rosie's room had acquired additional things: a pine cone she'd found that was notably large, a drawing she'd made of the cow in the lower barn, a small rock with a vein of quartz running through it that Silas had pointed out on one of their tracking walks. The yellow quilt had a small stain near the corner from where she'd brought her bread in to show Beatrice and had set it down too close to the edge of the shelf. The wooden horse had been joined by the dog and the bear, and there was a fourth animal in progress on Silas's workbench, something that might have been a fox. Hargrove stood in the doorway of the girl's room and looked at it for a moment. "She's settled," he said. "Not a question." "Yes," Beatrice said. "Any difficulties?" "The ordinary kind," she said. "She woke at night for the first week. She tested limits in the way children do when they're trying to understand if the limits will hold." She paused. They held. He turned from the room and looked at her directly. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, with a slightly different energy than he'd used at the station, "I'm going to be honest with you. When I came on that train with the girl, I had concerns about this arrangement." "I know you did," she said. "They were not unreasonable concerns." "No," she agreed. "They were not." He was quiet for a moment. "She's doing well," he said. "Better than I've seen children do in established households sometimes." He paused again. "The speed of the marriage concerned me. Still does, technically, but—" He stopped. "Children don't lie about how they feel, and that girl looks at you the way— She looks at you the way she ought to look at a mother." Beatrice let that land without responding to it immediately. It went somewhere deep and quiet, and she let it stay there. "I'll file the review as satisfactory," Hargrove said. "I don't anticipate further interventions unless something changes substantially." "Thank you," she said. He started toward the door, then stopped. "The arrangements you made in a single day," he said. "The room, the things in it." He looked at the shelf again briefly. "Someone thought about her before she arrived." "Yes," Beatrice said. "Someone did." He nodded once and left. Rosie overheard more than they knew. This was something Beatrice had begun to understand. The girl had the particular skill of children who have spent time in households where adult conversation stopped when they entered the room, which meant she had learned to be quiet in corners and listen. She wasn't malicious about it. She was gathering information the way any sensible creature gathers information about its environment when it doesn't yet fully trust the environment to remain stable. What she had overheard this time was Beatrice telling Silas, after Hargrove left and Rosie was supposedly absorbed in her letter practice at the table, that the review had gone well and there would be no further visits unless something changed. "That's something," Silas said. "It's a lot of things," Beatrice said. Later, when Silas had gone outside and they were alone, Rosie looked up from her letters. "Does this mean I stay?" she said. Beatrice turned from the shelf she'd been organizing. "Yes," she said. "You stay." For always? It was the word always that required care. She thought about Silas's second promise, that he would never let shame replace love. She thought about her own first condition, that he would never lie to the girl. "For as long as you want to be here," she said, "and I intend for you to want to be here for a very long time." Rosie processed this with the careful precision she brought to important information. "What if you and my father stopped getting along? Then we would handle that like adults and make sure you were safe and loved regardless. But I don't expect that to happen." "How do you know?" "Because your father is a man who keeps his word," Beatrice said, "and I don't commit to things I'm not prepared to see through." The girl went back to her letters. After a moment, without looking up, "I think you're going to be the best thing that ever happened to this cabin." Beatrice opened her mouth and closed it. "Finish your letters," she said, and went back to the shelf. Cham. The testing that Beatrice had predicted, the systematic kind, the kind with real teeth in it, arrived in the third week of February without particular warning on an ordinary Tuesday. Rosie had gone silent that morning in the specific way that was different from her thinking silent. She ate breakfast without comment, refused to engage with the bread lesson Beatrice had suggested, and sat by the window staring at the snow with the closed, sealed expression of a child who has gone somewhere interior and pulled the door shut behind her. Beatrice let it be for 2 hours. Then she sat down at the table across from her and said, "What happened?" "Nothing," Rosie said. "Something," Beatrice said. Silence. "You don't have to tell me now," Beatrice said. "But it doesn't go away by itself, whatever it is. I've tried that method. It doesn't work." Rosie looked at her, then, in a voice stripped of everything, "I had a dream about my mama last night." Beatrice stayed still. "She was in the kitchen in Millhaven, the one I remember. And I was there, and everything was the way it was before she got sick, and she was just normal, making coffee, talking." Rosie stopped. Her jaw was tight. "And then I woke up, and I knew it wasn't real. And I couldn't remember exactly what her face looked like." The particular horror of that, not losing the person, which is a known and terrible grief, but losing the details of them, the specific face, the specific voice, Beatrice understood it without needing it explained. She had lost her own mother at 16, and the fading had started within a year and never fully stopped. "That's one of the hardest parts," she said quietly. "And I'm not going to tell you it gets easier because I think that would be dishonest. But I will tell you that she's in the things you do, the way you approach things, the way you hold on to what matters." She paused. "You know how to read well above your years. Did your mother read to you?" Rosie nodded. "Then she's in that. Every book you read, she's part of how you received it." Rosie was quiet for a long time. Outside, the wind was working in the pines, and somewhere in the lower field, the cow made a comment about something. "I'm scared of forgetting her," Rosie said. "All the way." "I know," Beatrice said. "That's a real fear, and it makes sense." She thought carefully. "Would it help to write things down? The things you remember? Not all at once, just when they come to you." "Like what things?" "The color of her apron. Something funny she said. The way she smelled. What she called you when she was being affectionate." She paused. Small things last longer than you'd think when they're written down. Rosie considered this. "She called me Sparrow," she said, very quietly, "because when I was little, I made a sound like a bird when I was happy." "Then that goes down first," Beatrice said, "and it doesn't go anywhere." She got up and found a blank composition book in the back of the store supplies she'd brought up, the kind she'd stocked for years for the few children in the area who were being schooled at home. And she brought it back and set it on the table in front of Rosie with a pencil. Rosie looked at it. She picked up the pencil. She wrote something on the first page, slowly, and Beatrice did not look at what it was because it was not meant for her. When she was done, she closed the book and held it in both hands for a moment. "Thank you," she said. "It was just a book," Beatrice said. "You know it wasn't," Rosie said. "It will be." What happened the next day was the real test, the one Beatrice had been waiting for without knowing its specific shape. Silas had been gone overnight. A longer trapline run, unavoidable. Something he'd warned them both about 2 days in advance. He was due back by noon. He was not back by noon, or by 2, or by the time the light started going thin and gray in the way that preceded a mountain storm. Rosie sat by the window. She didn't say anything, but her whole body was a question she wasn't asking aloud, and the question was the oldest one she had. Is he coming back? Beatrice kept the fire. She made supper and set it aside to stay warm. She sat with her mending, and she did not look at the window because looking at the window wouldn't bring him down the mountain any faster, and looking at the window would confirm to Rosie that she was worried too. She was worried. She knew enough about mountain conditions in February to know that a storm coming in fast could change the calculus of a trapline run significantly. She also knew that Silas Mercer had been working these mountains for 15 years and knew them better than the terrain of his own face. Both things were true simultaneously, and neither one canceled the other. At 5 o'clock, Rosie said, "What if he doesn't come back?" "He'll come back," Beatrice said. She kept her voice even. "But what if—" "Rosie," she set down the mending, "your father knows this mountain the way you know this cabin now. Every corner, every place the floor creaks, every spot where the draft comes in. He knows where the weather comes from before it arrives. He knows how to read the signs." She paused. "He's also a man who promised he would stay, and your father keeps his word." "He promised you," Rosie said. "Not me." The distinction mattered. Beatrice understood why it mattered. "He made those promises because of you," she said. "Everything in this arrangement exists because of you." Rosie was quiet. She had her composition book on the table in front of her, which Beatrice noticed. She'd been adding to it in the hours since Silas hadn't come home. "I wrote down something today," Rosie said. "Something I remembered about my mama that I thought I'd forgotten." "What was it?" "She used to burn toast every time, even when she was paying attention." A small, involuntary thing moved across her face. Not quite a smile, but its close neighbor. "She used to say the toast was developing character." "That's a good one," Beatrice said. "She would have liked you," Rosie said. It came out simply, without apparent calculation, the way children state things they have decided are true. She liked people who said real things. Beatrice looked at her for a moment. "I would have liked her too," she said, based on the available evidence. The door opened at 6:45. Silas came in with ice in his beard and one sleeve of his coat torn at the shoulder and snow packed into every seam of his clothing, and he stood in the doorway for a second, registering the warmth of the cabin, and then Rosie crossed the room and hit him somewhere around the midsection with her full momentum, and he caught her without staggering, which was a near thing given the state of him. "You're late," she said into his coat. "I know," he said. "I'm sorry." "The trail iced over," she said, which was not a question. "Yes," he said. "North-facing slope above the second creek. Took me a long time to find the safe way around." She pulled back and looked at his face with that same frank inventory. "You're cold. Very." "Sit down," she said, with the specific authority of someone who has been worrying for 3 hours and is converting it into action. "Beatrice made supper. I'll get your boots." He sat. He looked over her head at Beatrice, and something passed between them that wasn't a conversation exactly, but was the adult equivalent of Rosie's composition book. A record of something kept, something that mattered, set down in a place where it wouldn't get lost. "Supper's warm," Beatrice said. "Good," he said. "Ciao." In the third week of February, the cruelty arrived from a direction she hadn't fully anticipated. It came wrapped in a social call. Constance Webb, who ran the boarding house and considered herself the standard by which all domestic arrangements in Red Ash Ridge were measured, made the trip up the mountain on a clear morning with a pie she'd made and the particular bright-eyed energy of a woman who has been collecting information from a distance and wants to gather some closer in. Beatrice received her without warmth and without hostility. She set the pie on the table and made coffee and sat across from Constance in the 2 chairs by the fire, and Rosie, who had been doing her letters, picked up her composition book and went to her room with the instinct of a child who recognizes a certain kind of adult energy and prefers to be elsewhere. Constance watched her go. She's settled, she said, which was what Hargrove had said, but it sounded different in Constance Webb's mouth. She has, Beatrice agreed. People weren't sure she would, Constance said. A child in that situation, and the circumstances being what they were. What circumstances were those? Constance smiled the smile of a woman performing candor. Well, the suddenness of it all. Marrying a man you barely knew, taking on his child, moving up here. She gestured vaguely at the cabin. I think most people thought you were setting yourself up for heartbreak. Most people underestimate me, Beatrice said pleasantly. That's always been true. Well, yes, but Constance rearranged herself slightly. You have to understand how it looked from the outside, Beatrice. A man comes into town asking for a wife, and the only woman who says yes is... She stopped. Is what? Beatrice said. The pause was long enough to be its own sentence. Is me, Beatrice finished for her. That's what you're saying. The only woman who said yes was me, and that seemed like confirmation of what everyone already believed about both of us. I didn't say that. You stopped before saying it, Beatrice said. That's close enough. Constance's bright social manner had gone slightly stiff at the edges. I'm just saying that people wondered whether it was sustainable, whether a man like Silas Mercer, once he was back on his feet, would feel the same about the arrangement. Beatrice looked at her. She looked at her for long enough that Constance shifted in her chair. Constance, she said, I have spent 42 years in this territory watching people underestimate me. They underestimated what I could do at the store. They underestimated what I could absorb and survive and still show up the next morning. And they are underestimating this. She stopped. You ate from this family's table many times when it was more practical for you than cooking at the boarding house. And I never charged you, and I never said a word. I'm saying a word now. If you've come up here to see if the arrangement is as precarious as you hoped it was, you're going to have a disappointing trip home. Constance Webb left 40 minutes later with most of her pie still on the table, and the specific compressed expression of a woman who has encountered more resistance than she expected and is organizing her narrative around it. Beatrice sat at the table and looked at the pie. From the back room, the door opened. Rosie appeared in the hallway. She had clearly heard the whole thing. You didn't yell at her, she observed. Yelling wastes energy, Beatrice said. My teacher in Millhaven used to say you should always stay calm when people are mean to you, Rosie said, but it seemed like she was just saying it. You actually did it. It gets easier, Beatrice said. Mostly. Rosie looked at the pie. Can we eat it? It would be a shame to let it go to waste, Beatrice said. They ate it with forks directly from the pie dish, standing at the counter, and Rosie said it was a good pie despite everything, and Beatrice agreed that it was, and that quality and character were completely separate things and always had been. The worst night happened at the end of February. It had been building, she thought, looking back later. The specific pressure of three people trying to make something new out of the materials of three separate broken things, which is not the same as making something out of nothing. It is harder, because the broken edges have to fit together without simply re-breaking each other. It started over something small, which is how these things usually start. Rosie had come in from the barn where she'd been learning to manage the cow under Silas's instruction, and she had tracked mud across the clean floor. And Beatrice had said something about it that was more tired than patient, and Rosie had said something back that was more sharp than intended. You're not my real mother, Rosie said. The words landed in the kitchen like something physical. Beatrice went still, not the kind of still that comes from being struck exactly. She had expected this, had been waiting for it in some form, had told Silas it would come. But there is a difference between knowing a thing is coming and experiencing its actual arrival. She took a breath. You're right, she said. I'm not. Rosie's face did something complicated. She had clearly expected a different response. Some reaction, some hurt she could point to, some withdrawal she could measure. The agreement disoriented her. Then you can't tell me what to do, she said, less certain than the first statement. Testing the new ground. Your father can, Beatrice said evenly, and he'd tell you the same thing about the floor since we both clean it. You don't know what he'd say. Rosie. Beatrice turned from the counter and looked at her directly. I know you're angry, and I know it's not really about the mud. Don't tell me what I'm angry about. Fair, Beatrice said. Tell me then. The The girl opened her mouth and closed it. Her hands were balled in her coat pockets, and her face had that sealed, furious look of a child who has too many things happening inside her to sort which one belongs at the surface. "I don't know," she said, and the admission cost her something. You could hear it, the admission that the anger had no clean address, that it existed without a specific origin she could identify. "That's the hardest kind," Beatrice said, "when it doesn't have a name." "I'm not crying," Rosie said, though she was close to it. "I know. She stopped. "Sometimes I wake up and for a second I don't remember that she's dead. And then I remember. And I don't know where to put that." Beatrice crossed the room and sat down at the table. Not next to her, not reaching for her, just present, a body in the room, available but not pressing. "You're allowed to put it wherever it goes," she said. "Even at me sometimes. I'm not made of glass." She paused. "But I do need you to clean the floor." Rosie let out something between a laugh and a sob. It surprised both of them. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth. "I didn't mean it," she said. "What I said." "I know," Beatrice said. "I also know there's some truth in it, and truth doesn't stop being true just because we don't mean it. I'm not your mother. I'm something else. I don't know yet exactly what to call it, but I'm not going anywhere. That part is settled." Rosie wiped her face with her sleeve. She got the mop from beside the stove and cleaned the floor without being asked again, with methodical, still angry efficiency. When she was done, she put the mop back. She stood in the middle of the clean floor and looked at Beatrice. "When my father comes in," she said, "his boots are worse than mine." "I know," Beatrice said. "I've spoken to him about it twice, and I expect to speak to him about it several more times." "Does he listen?" "He's improving," Beatrice said. Slowly, Rosie almost smiled. "Okay," she said, and went to wash her hands. Yummed. It was Silas she told that evening, briefly and without drama, once Rosie was asleep. They were sitting at the table in the quiet of the cabin at the end of the day, the particular companionable quiet they had arrived at sometime in the last week, which was different from the careful early quiet of two strangers navigating around each other and felt more like the natural silence of two people who don't need to fill space. And she said I wasn't her real mother today. He looked up from the piece of leather he'd been working. "She didn't mean it as a wound," Beatrice said. "She meant it as a test. But I want you to know it happened." "Are you—" He paused. "Are you all right?" The question surprised her. Not its existence, but its directness, the simplicity of it, the absence of any attempt to manage or redirect the question into something more comfortable. "Yes," she said, and meant it. "It was hard to hear, and I'm all right. Those two things can both be true." He was quiet for a moment. "She came to find me after supper," he said. "She told me you were teaching her about plants, that you'd shown her how to identify 3 kinds of medicine in the root cellar." "She's sharp," Beatrice said. "She retains things quickly." "She also said—" He stopped. Then, "She said she thought you were probably the most capable person she'd ever met, including adults." A pause. She was specific about including adults. Beatrice looked at the fire for a moment. "She's 7, she said. "Her sample size is limited." "Maybe," Silas said. "I think she's a fair judge." He said it simply, and then went back to his leather work, and she went back to her mending, and the fire held steady in the wood stove, and outside the mountain was dark and cold and indifferent. The way mountains are, and inside the cabin something was being built out of imperfect materials by imperfect hands, slowly and without guarantee, which is the only way anything real ever gets built at all. The discovery came on a Tuesday morning in the first week of March, when the light had begun to change, barely, just the suggestion of change, the way a room changes when someone opens a curtain in a distant part of the house, and the days were a few minutes longer than they had been. Rosie had been in the root cellar getting the jar of dried chamomile Beatrice had sent her for, and she came back not with the chamomile but with a box she'd found on the bottom shelf, pushed to the back behind the winter squash. It was a flat wooden box, the kind used for storing documents, and she carried it with the careful attention of someone who understands they've found something that has weight. "What's this?" she asked. Beatrice looked at it. Something shifted in her face before she could arrange it otherwise. Where did you find that? Bottom shelf. In the back. Rosie held it out. Is it yours? It was, Beatrice said. She took it. She set it on the table and looked at it for a moment with an expression that Rosie had not seen on her before. Something complicated and private, and not for the current moment. What's in it? Rosie asked. Old plans, Beatrice said, for something I thought about doing a long time ago. She slid the box back toward the edge of the table. Leave it for now. Get the chamomile. It's behind the beets. Rosie got the chamomile, but she looked at the box twice more before lunch, and she was smart enough not to ask again that day, and Beatrice knew she had noticed the not asking was a thing she was doing deliberately. That night, after Rosie was in bed, Silas came in from checking the animals and found Beatrice at the table with the box open in front of her and a sheaf of papers laid out. Drawings, plans in her own careful hand, lists of books and costs and layouts, all of it old enough to have gone slightly yellow at the edges. He stood in the doorway and looked at the papers and didn't ask. She looked up. She had not been crying, but she had the expression of someone who has been sitting with something long enough to reach the other side of whatever it was. I was going to open a school, she said. He came in. He sat down at the table. He looked at the plans without touching them. For frontier children, she said. The ones who can't get to the town school because of distance or weather or families who need them for work in the fields. I had it all worked out. The curriculum, the costs, the space requirements, the way to make it work with seasonal farming schedules. She was quiet for a moment. I was 29. I'd been running the store for 3 years, and I had a little money saved, and I thought... She stopped. What happened? Silas said. People laughed, she said. Not all at once, not in a room. The way it happens when you tell people your plans quietly and they tell someone else. And the idea gets around, and it comes back to you changed. They said, the consensus was that a woman who looked the way I looked didn't have the standing to be taken seriously as an educator, that parents wouldn't send their children to be taught by someone like me. She paused. I was told this by 4 separate people in the same week. By the 5th person, I stopped trying. Silas looked at the plans. He reached out and turned one of the drawings so he could see it right side up. A floor plan, carefully drafted, with rooms labeled in her precise handwriting. This is good work, he said. It was, she agreed. It still is, he said. The work doesn't go bad just because you stop doing it. She looked at him. He was looking at the floor plan with the same focused attention he gave to trail conditions and trapping signs, reading it seriously, as a real thing, not as a courtesy. You couldn't do it then, he said. The circumstances weren't right. The support wasn't there. He looked up at her. Those things change. She looked at the papers, at the plans she'd spent 6 months developing at 29 and then folded into a box and carried with her for 13 years without opening. Maybe they do, she said. Maybe you should think about it, he said. Not now, but when things are more settled. He paused. Rosie needs schooling. Half the children on this mountain need schooling. And you? He stopped. You're the most capable person I've met, he said. And I've met a lot of people in a lot of conditions. Most of them weren't fit to assess you. She looked at him for a moment. He said it matter-of-factly and then got up to pour water into the kettle. And she sat at the table with the plan spread in front of her and felt something that had been locked in that box for 13 years begin, very slowly, to move. She put the plans back in the box that night, but she didn't push the box to the back of the shelf. She set it on the windowsill in the main room, where the morning light would hit it. It was a small thing, the difference between a box in the back of a root cellar and a box on a windowsill, but Beatrice had learned over 42 years that small things were often the only honest measure of where a person actually stood with themselves. The box on the windowsill meant she was thinking about it. The box in the root cellar had meant she was done. She wasn't done. She was beginning to understand that she hadn't been done for a long time. She'd just been waiting for conditions that made beginning feel survivable. Rosie noticed the box on the windowsill the next morning and said nothing about it, which meant she'd thought about it and decided to wait. The girl's patience was a specific kind. Not passive, not absence of interest, but the active patience of someone who understands that some things have to be approached from the side. Silas noticed it too. He poured his coffee and looked at the windowsill and looked at Beatrice and went outside without saying anything, which was its own kind of statement. March came in with a week of clear, cold days that made the mountain look like something drawn with sharp instruments, every ridgeline precise, every pine tree a clean, dark shape against blue sky. The snow was still deep, but the character of it had changed, the crust going glassy in the afternoons, the light lasting noticeably longer than it had even 2 weeks before. Rosie began spending more time outside, trailing Silas on his trapline checks with the single-minded dedication she brought to anything she'd decided to master. She came home on the 4th day of March with her composition book under her arm and mud on her boots, and the specific bright-eyed energy of someone who has been paying close attention to the world and has things to report. "I found fox tracks," she said, standing in the doorway before she'd even taken off her coat. "And then I found where the fox had been hunting a mouse, and I could see the whole story in the snow, where the mouse had been running, and where the fox had pounced, and where the mouse had, well," she paused. "The mouse didn't make it." "Life on the mountain," Beatrice said. "Papa said it's not cruel, it's just efficient." Rosie pulled off her coat and hung it on the peg. "He said everything eats and everything gets eaten eventually, and the only honest position is to be clear-eyed about it. Your father has a way of putting things plainly." "I wrote it down," Rosie said, patting the composition book. "I'm writing down things people say that are actually true, not just polite." She paused. "I wrote down what you said about skill accumulating, and about burned toast developing character, and what you said about lonely hearts." Beatrice looked at her. "You remember that?" "I've thought about it a lot," Rosie said matter-of-factly. "On the platform, that's the first thing you said to me." She set the composition book on the table and opened it to a page near the front, and there it was in the girl's careful child's handwriting. "Lonely hearts recognize each other long before beautiful faces do." B. Beneath it, in the same handwriting, "This was the first real thing an adult ever said to me." Beatrice looked at that line for a moment longer than she meant to. "That's a generous assessment," she said when she trusted her voice. "It's accurate," Rosie said, and closed the book, and went to wash her hands before lunch. The trouble arrived, as trouble usually does, from a direction they'd been watching and a direction they hadn't. The direction they'd been watching was Nora Pitsley, who had been conducting a slow, sustained campaign of social opinion-making about the Mercer household since the wedding. Beatrice heard about it in pieces, from Edna Marsh, who was too honest to soften things much, from Pete Alderson, who mentioned it with the guilty air of a man who has repeated something he shouldn't have, and from the particular silence that fell in certain groups when she came into town that told her the conversation had been happening before she arrived. The substance of Nora's campaign was not simple malice, which would have been easier to dismiss. It was the more complicated kind, the kind that wraps its cruelty in apparent concern. She was saying that Silas Mercer had made a desperate choice under desperate circumstances, and would come to regret it when the immediate crisis was resolved. She was saying that Rosie deserved a mother who was younger and better suited to the physical demands of mountain life. She was saying, with the particular precision of a woman who knows exactly how much to imply without actually saying, that a man like Silas would not stay content with an arrangement like this once he had time to look around at his options. None of it was said to Beatrice's face. All of it reached her. She handled it the way she handled most things, steadily, without visible reaction, filing it in the category of things that were not worth the energy of direct engagement. She had been doing that with Nora Pitsley for 20 years. She was practiced at it. What she was not practiced at was the direction she hadn't been watching. That came from the county. It was Silas who found out first, and the way he told her, sitting down at the table across from her on a Tuesday evening in the second week of March, setting his hat in front of him, not reaching for his coffee, told her before he'd said a word that it was serious. "There's a man named Doyle," he said, "regional land assessor. He's been going through property records in the county for the last month, looking for what he's calling irregularities." He paused. "He found one on our title." Beatrice set down what she was holding. "What kind of irregularity?" "The kind that my father created in 1871 when he filed the original homestead claim," Silas said. "There was a second filing on the same parcel 6 months earlier by a man named August Pryor. My father didn't know about it when he filed, or if he did, he didn't say. But Pryor's descendants are still alive, and Doyle has apparently been in correspondence with them. That's 40 acres, Beatrice said. Yes. Your house is on those 40 acres. Yes, he said again. How long have you known about this? I didn't. Until 2 days ago, when Doyle sent a notice to the county office, and Calvin Rudd sent word up to me. He looked at his hat. The original claim was valid enough to file, but not clean enough to be uncontestable. Doyle is saying the Pryor descendants have a legitimate competing claim to approximately 18 of the 40 acres, the upper portion, where the main water source is. Beatrice sat with that for a moment. Without the upper portion and its spring, the remaining land was workable but significantly diminished. The cabin was on the lower portion, which meant they wouldn't lose the house. But they would lose the water, which in practical terms on a mountain was not much different. What does Doyle want? She asked. Silas looked up. I'm not sure Doyle wants anything specifically, he said. He's doing his job. The Pryor descendants are the ones with a position here. He paused. Their representative sent a letter. They're offering to settle the competing claim for $400. $400. She did the arithmetic automatically, the way she'd been doing arithmetic her whole adult life. It was more than she had in the store account, more than Silas had from a winter's trapping. It was not an impossible sum, but it was a sum that required either time they might not have or arrangements she didn't love. What's the timeline? She said. Doyle wants a response within 60 days. If we don't respond, the competing claim goes to a formal hearing, and at a formal hearing with the documentation the Pryor family apparently has, our position is not strong. Then we have 60 days to either pay $400 or build a case that the original filing holds, she said. Yes. Which is stronger, the payment or the case? He was quiet. The payment, he said. The original filing has problems. My father wasn't a careful man with paperwork. She nodded slowly. She stood up. She went to the window and looked at the dark mountain and the stars that were beginning to appear above the ridge line, and she thought about the store account and the property value and the specific landscape of options available to them, which was not large. I need to look at the original filing documents, she said. Do you have them? In the box under the bench. Get them out, she said. I want to read them tonight. Dan. She read them twice. Then she read the letter from the Pryor representative, a man named Garrett Cole, who wrote with the specific, smooth confidence of someone who believes their position is airtight and wants you to believe the same. Some of what he said was accurate. Some of it was less accurate than he presented it. In one paragraph, a section describing the boundaries of the original Pryor claim, contained a description that, when she cross-referenced it against the original homestead filing her father-in-law had made, described a parcel that overlapped with the Mercer land by considerably less than 18 acres. She went through the boundary descriptions 3 times, with the lamp turned up as far as it would go, and each time she came out at the same number. 11 acres, not 18. The overlap was 11 acres, and it did not include the upper spring. She sat at the table with both documents in front of her and thought carefully. She was not a lawyer. She was a woman who had run accounts for 20 years and had learned to read documents with care because documents that were read carelessly cost you money. The boundary discrepancy might mean nothing, might be a different surveying method, a different reference point, or it might mean that Garrett Cole was either mistaken or not fully honest about the extent of the competing claim. She needed to know which. Silas, she said. He was on the far side of the room, doing nothing in particular. The specific, restless stillness of a man who is waiting for someone else to work through something because he recognizes they're better at it than he is and is managing his own anxiety about that. He came to the table. She showed him the 2 boundary descriptions side by side and walked him through the discrepancy. He followed it. He was better with numbers than he let on. She had noticed this. And when she finished, he sat back and looked at both pages. The spring is outside the Pryor boundary even on their own description, he said. If I'm reading it right, she said, which is not a certainty, but it's worth having someone with legal training look at before we agree to pay $400 for a problem that might be 7 acres smaller than they're claiming. Who do we take it to? Calvin Rudd will know someone in Glenfield, she said. He's dealt with property filings before, and it's worth the trip. He looked at her. You'd go to Glenfield? Someone has to look at this correctly, she said. "And I'm the one who found it." She went to Glenfield on a Thursday, 4 days later, on the morning stage. She brought both documents and the notes she'd made, and the careful written summary she'd spent an evening preparing, which laid out the discrepancy in plain language that a lawyer could assess quickly without having to reconstruct her reasoning. Silas had offered to come. She'd told him to stay with Rosie. "She's in school," he said. She'd started Rosie on formal lessons 2 weeks earlier, 2 hours each morning at the kitchen table, using the curriculum she'd designed 13 years ago and retrieved from the box on the windowsill, slightly adapted. It was not yet the school she'd planned, but it was the thing that preceded the school, and it was working. "She'll be done by noon," Beatrice said, "and she'll want you there when she is. Go over what she's been doing with the tracking. Let her show you what she's learned." She paused. "She needs to show you things. It matters to her." He'd looked like he wanted to argue and then thought better of it, which was one of his better qualities. The lawyer in Glenfield was a man named Herbert Payne, who was 60 years old and had been doing property law in the territory for 30 of them. He received her with the slightly adjusted manner of a man who has assessed her quickly and is recalibrating based on what she puts on his desk, which she appreciated. She didn't need him to think well of her before she'd given him reason to. She needed him to look at the documents. He looked at them for 20 minutes while she sat across from his desk and did not speak. "Where did you find this?" he said finally, pointing to the boundary description in the prior letter. "I was comparing the two filings," she said. "The reference points are different, but they can be mapped to the same physical markers. When you do that, the overlap is smaller than Cole is representing." "Significantly smaller," Payne said. He looked up at her over his glasses. "Mrs. Mercer, you are either a very careful reader or you have legal training I'm not aware of." "I keep books," she said. "I've been reading documents carefully for 20 years because inaccurate documents cost money." He looked back at the pages. "The spring is not in contention," he said. "Based on this, the prior claim, even if valid, does not extend to the water source. Cole either made an error or he was hoping no one would catch the difference. Can you make that case formally?" "I can make it clearly," he said. "Whether the prior descendants want to press the reduced claim or settle at a lower figure is their decision. But the $400 demand is not supportable on the actual documents." He paused. "I'll write to Cole directly, with the corrected boundary analysis. If he's a competent man, he'll revise the settlement figure significantly. If he isn't, we'll take it to the hearing and he'll look like a fool." "What's your fee?" she asked. He named a figure that was less than she'd expected. She accepted it without negotiating because it was fair, and she had more important things to spend her energy on. On the stage home, with the late afternoon light coming through the window and the mountains getting closer again, she thought about the specific satisfaction of finding the thing in the document that changed everything. It was not dramatically different from the satisfaction she'd felt at 29, sketching floor plans for a school that didn't exist yet. The same kind of mind at work. The kind that looks at a problem and asks what it actually says rather than what it appears to say. She had spent 13 years believing the world's assessment of that mind, that it was insufficient, that it didn't have the standing. She looked at the mountains coming closer and thought, that was their error, not mine. The letter from Payne to Cole went out on a Friday. The response came back in 12 days, which was faster than Beatrice expected, and suggested that Cole had looked at Payne's analysis, understood its implications, and made a rapid decision. The revised settlement offer was $90 for the actual 11 acres of overlap, which did not include the water source. $90 was manageable. It was still not easy, a winter's trapping plus the store income, carefully arranged, but it was the kind of difficult that had a solution rather than the kind that didn't. Silas read the letter twice. He set it on the table. "You saved this place," he said. "I read the documents," she said. "Don't make it larger than it was." "It was large," he said. "It was necessary," she said. "There's a difference." He looked at her for a moment. "Is there?" She thought about it honestly. "Maybe not," she said. They settled the claim 2 weeks later. Calvin Rudd processed the paperwork and told them the title was now clean as it was ever going to be, given the history, which was the kind of reassurance that was also a caveat, but it was the honest version, and she preferred honesty to comfort. What she hadn't expected was how Rosie handled it. She had known the land dispute was happening. She overheard things, as she always did. But she had not been told the details, and Beatrice had made the conscious decision not to involve her more than necessary in something that was primarily adult business. She was 7. She needed to know the family was stable, not the specific mechanics of why. But on the evening the settlement was signed, when supper was over and the dishes were done and the 3 of them were in the main room in the comfortable arrangement they'd developed, Silas at the table, Beatrice by the fire, Rosie on the deerskin rug with a book, Rosie looked up and said, "Is the land problem fixed?" "Yes," Beatrice said. "Because of what you did in Glenfield?" "Partly," Beatrice said. "Because of what your father did building this place legitimately for 15 years, and because someone read the documents carefully." Rosie was quiet for a moment. Then, "You're going to open the school, aren't you?" The directness of it, the way she landed on the thing that was connected without being told the connection, made Beatrice blink. "I'm thinking about it," she said. "I think you should." Rosie turned back to her book with the matter-of-fact air of someone who has stated an obvious thing and doesn't see the need to belabor it. "There are 3 children just on this part of the mountain who don't go to school because it's too far. I know because I asked them." "When did you ask them?" "When Papa takes me along to check the lower trap lines. We pass the Henderson place and the Daly farm." She paused. "Agnes Henderson is 8, and she can barely read, and she's embarrassed about it. I told her I'd teach her what I know so far, but I told her that wasn't much yet." Silas was looking at his daughter with an expression Beatrice had not seen on him before. Something open and slightly undone. The face of a man encountering something larger than he expected in a place he was learning to look. That was thoughtful," he said. "It was practical," Rosie said, with an echo of Beatrice's own phrasing that was probably unintentional and was completely exact. "Ignorance is expensive. You taught me that." "I said that about a different thing," Beatrice said. "It applies to more than one thing," Rosie said. March moved toward April with the specific momentum of a mountain spring, which is not the gentle arrival of lower country springs, but something more aggressive. Snowmelt that could flood a path overnight, mud so deep it swallowed boot heels, sudden warmth followed by a last hard frost that killed the early things if you weren't watching for it. Beatrice was watching for it. She had begun a kitchen garden in a sheltered spot on the south-facing side of the cabin, working the ground in the hours between lessons and cooking, and Rosie helped with the focused enthusiasm she brought to any new skill. They planted things in stages, reading the temperature of the soil with the back of the hand the way an old woman in Red Ash Ridge had taught Beatrice when she was 10, and Beatrice taught Rosie the same way, not telling, mostly, but showing, putting the girl's hand against the ground and asking what she felt. "Cold," Rosie said, "but not frozen cold, like cold that's thinking about being warmer." "That's about right," Beatrice said. "Another week." Silas watched this from a distance sometimes. He was not a man who joined things easily, not family activities, not community, not the easy gathering that other men managed without apparent effort. He moved around the edges of scenes rather than into them, and for the first weeks Beatrice had wondered whether this was something to address or something to accept. She had concluded it was somewhere between the two, a man who needed to understand that he was allowed in before he would walk through the door, not because he lacked the desire, but because he'd spent enough years on the outside of his own life that entering it took more effort than it looked. She started including him sideways. Not directly, not "come look at what we're doing," or "join us," which would have embarrassed him and possibly made him retreat further. Sideways. She started asking him questions that required him to bring what he knew to where they were. What was the drainage like on this side of the cabin? Had he noticed which direction the prevailing wind came from in spring? What did he know about the wild plants that grew at the edge of the woodline? He knew a great deal. He knew it precisely and from long observation, and as he answered her questions, he moved closer without seeming to notice. He was doing it, until one morning he was crouching beside them both in the garden plot, pointing out a spot where a seep ran underground and would make the south corner wet in heavy rain, and Rosie was asking him questions with the same technique Beatrice had been using, and he was answering with a looseness in his voice she hadn't heard before. Afterward, when Rosie had gone inside, he stayed crouched by the garden border and looked at the dirt and said, "Did you plan that?" "Plan what?" she said. He glanced at her sideways. "You know what." "I asked questions I needed answers to," she said. "You happen to know them." She paused. "It's not a complicated plan." "No," he said. "It's a good one." He stood. I know I'm not easy to pull into things." "You're in the garden," she said. "I think that's sufficient for a Tuesday morning." He almost laughed. She had been accumulating these almost laughs the way Rosie accumulated skills, one at a time, slowly, each one evidence of something moving in the right direction. The thing that happened in the second week of April changed the scale of everything. It came on a Sunday afternoon when Silas had gone into Red Ash Ridge for supplies, and Beatrice was at the cabin with Rosie running her through long division, which Rosie had decided to approach as a personal adversary that she intended to defeat through sheer obstinance. A woman appeared at the door. She was perhaps 35, dark-haired and thin in the way of someone who has been working very hard for a long time, and she had a child on each side of her, a girl of maybe 9 and a boy of 6, and the expression of someone who has walked a long way and rehearsed what she wanted to say multiple times and is still not sure of her reception. "Mrs. Mercer?" she said. "Yes," Beatrice said. "I'm May Daly, from the Daly Farm, Lower Slope." She stopped. "My daughter told me," Rosie Mercer told my daughter, "that you're teaching school. Up here." Beatrice looked at her. "I'm teaching Rosie," she said carefully. "I've been talking about the possibility of—" "I know it's not organized yet," May Daly said. She had the clipped, preemptive manner of someone who has been told no before and is trying to account for objections before they arrive. "I know it's not formal, but my two—" She looked down at the children on either side of her. "Tom here can't read at all. Emma reads some, but not well. The town school is 6 miles, and in winter I can't get them there, and in summer, they're needed for the farm, and I just—" She stopped, swallowed. "I heard you're the woman who ran a store for 12 years and kept the books so well that nobody's accounts were ever wrong. I heard you'd done schooling plans." She lifted her chin slightly, the gesture of someone asking for something they know they may not get. "I'd pay what I could. It wouldn't be much, but I'd pay what I could." Beatrice stood in the doorway and looked at May Daly and her 2 children, Tom with his father's serious face already settled on him at 6, Emma with her hands folded in front of her in the careful posture of a child on her best behavior. And she thought about the box on the windowsill, the plans that were still there, the conversation with Silas about things that change. "Come in," she said. "Both of them. Let me see where they are." May Daly let out a breath. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet," Beatrice said. "I'm going to give them some problems to work through and see what we're dealing with." She stepped back from the door. "There's coffee if you'd like it." From the table, Rosie looked up from her long division and saw the 2 children come in and looked at Beatrice with an expression that was completely composed and gave away absolutely nothing, which meant she was very pleased with herself. "This is Emma and Tom," Beatrice said to her. "They're going to join us for a while. Can you show Emma where we keep the composition books?" "Yes," Rosie said, and stood with the particular dignity of someone who has just been given a responsibility and intends to be serious about it. She went to the shelf and got a composition book and a pencil and brought them to Emma and said, "Sit here. Beatrice will tell you what to do, but I'll help if you get stuck. I've been doing this for a while." Emma sat. Tom climbed onto the bench beside her and looked at the pencil with a combination of suspicion and interest. May Daly sat by the fire with her coffee and watched her children settle around Beatrice's table, and the expression on her face was the kind that has no clean name. Relief and gratitude and something tired underneath both of them that was beginning, slowly, to relax its grip. Beatrice sat across from the 2 new children and looked at them and said, "All right, let's find out what you know." By the time Silas came back from town, there were 3 children at the kitchen table. He stood in the doorway with his supplies and looked at the scene, Beatrice moving between Rosie's long division and Emma's letter practice, and Tom's first careful attempt at writing his own name. And he took it in without speaking. He set the supplies on the counter. He hung his coat. He made coffee and brought her a cup without being asked, and set it beside her on the table and went to sit in his chair, and he watched. After a while, when the children were absorbed enough that he could speak without disrupting them, he said quietly, "How long was I gone?" 3 hours, she said, also quietly. "The school started while I was buying flour," he said. "The school's been starting for a while," she said. "Today it just became slightly more visible." He looked at the 3 children and at Beatrice moving between them, and at Rosie helping Emma hold the pencil correctly with the precise patience of a child who remembers being helped with that exact thing not long ago, and he looked at all of it the way he'd looked at the floor plan on the table in March. Seriously, as a real thing, not as something surprising. "You need more table space," he said. She looked up. "If it's going to be more than 3 children," he said, "the table is too small. I can build out from the east wall. It won't take more than a week." She looked at him for a moment. "You don't have to—" "I know," he said, and picked up his coffee. Silas built the table extension in 6 days, not 7. He worked on it in the mornings before the children arrived and in the evenings after they left, and he did not make a production of it. He measured twice and cut once, and assembled the thing with the same quiet precision he brought to everything that required his hands. No wasted motion, no commentary, just the work getting done. On the morning of the 7th day, he sanded the surface until it matched the original table closely enough that you had to look for the seam, and when Beatrice ran her hand across the join, she looked up at him, and he shrugged the way a man shrugs when he knows something is good work and doesn't need to say so. The table now seated 8 comfortably. By the 2nd week of April, it seated 7 children on 3 mornings a week, which was more than Beatrice had planned, and exactly as many as the east wall of the cabin could accommodate, if you put the bench flush against it and didn't mind children's elbows occasionally connecting with the log wall. May Daly's 2 had come back every session. Agnes Henderson had started the week after, brought by her mother Ruth, a quiet woman who had apologized twice at the door for imposing before Beatrice told her clearly that she was not imposing and to come in. A boy named William Foss appeared on a Wednesday with a note from his father explaining that William was 10 and had never attended school and was embarrassed about it, and could they please not make a fuss about where he was starting from. Beatrice did not make a fuss. She put William beside Rosie, who was 9 months younger and considerably further along, and she watched William's jaw tighten with pride and then deliberately relax as Rosie showed him something without any performance of superiority. Rosie had the instinct, she'd had it from the beginning, the ability to help someone without making the help feel like a diminishment. Beatrice didn't know whether she'd been born with it or whether losing her mother young had built it in her, the specific sensitivity to what dignity costs and what it's worth. Probably both things, she thought. Usually it's both things. The 7th child was Tom Daly, whom she'd started on letter recognition at the kitchen table 6 weeks earlier. He was making progress that was measurable but not fast, because he was 6. And 6 is not an age that prioritizes measurable progress. And sometimes he spent 20 minutes staring at the letter B with the specific committed vacancy of a child who has gone somewhere pleasant in his head and left his body at the table. Beatrice had learned to give him a different task during these excursions rather than call him back, because the calling back produced resistance, and the different task produced re-engagement. She kept this information to herself and recorded it in the margin of her teaching notes, because it was the kind of thing that was useful and that she intended to write down properly eventually. She was filling 3 composition books now, in addition to the one Rosie had started with. Curriculum notes, observation notes about each child, things that worked and things that didn't, recorded without sentiment because sentiment in teaching notes made them useless. The box of plans from the windowsill was on the table most days. Check. The avalanche happened on a Wednesday in the 3rd week of April, and it happened fast, the way avalanches do. One moment the mountain was a mountain, and the next moment a portion of it had decided to rearrange itself, and the rearrangement had caught 3 families in the middle of it. Silas heard it before anyone else did, which she later understood was because he knew the specific sounds the mountain made and could distinguish them, the way a man who has spent 15 years in a place learns to read its voice. He'd been on the upper trapline and had turned downslope before the second wave of sound reached Red Ash Ridge, and he was already at the Henderson place, which sat exposed on the north-facing slope that had let go when the snow settled. The Henderson cabin was partially collapsed. Ruth Henderson and her two older children had gotten out, but Agnes and the youngest boy were somewhere inside the debris, and Ruth was making a sound that carried down the mountain in a way that required no interpretation. What happened in the next 6 hours was not something Beatrice planned. It was what the situation required, and she was there and she could see what was needed, and so she did it, which is the honest account of most things that get called remarkable afterward. She had been at the cabin with the 4 children who had come for lessons that morning when Silas's voice came from outside. Not shouting, but with the specific edge of someone who needs speed and is being precise about it. She was out the door before he'd finished the sentence. She told Rosie to stay with the younger children and keep them calm and not open the door to anyone she didn't know. Rosie's face went white and then went practical in a way that would have made Beatrice's heart clench if she'd had time for it. She didn't have time for it. "Henderson Place," Silas said. "North Slope let go. Ruth is out, but Agnes and the boy are in the debris. I need more hands." "Go," she said. "I'll follow. Who else is close?" "Foss Farm is a mile east. Daly Farm is below." "I'll get them," she said. He went back up the slope at a pace that was not quite running, but covered ground faster than most men ran, and she went to the Foss farm first because it was closer and banged on the door and told Warren Foss what had happened in 3 sentences, and he had his coat on before she finished and was calling back into the house for his 2 older sons. At the Daly farm, May came to the door and looked at Beatrice's face and said, "How bad?" And Beatrice told her, and May was already turning to organize before Beatrice had finished. "My barn can hold families," May said, "for as long as they need. You'll want a warm place to bring them." "I'll need food," Beatrice said. "Whatever you have. I'll get what's at the cabin. Can you send someone to the next farm east?" "My eldest," May said. "He knows those people." She was back at her own cabin in 20 minutes, packing everything she could carry. Blankets, food, the medical supplies she'd assembled over the winter because she was a woman who thought about what would be needed before it was needed. Rosie was at the table with all 4 children, reading to them in a steady voice about something that had nothing to do with avalanches, and she looked up when Beatrice came in and read the situation in a second. "I need you to keep doing exactly what you're doing," Beatrice said. "Is Agnes hurt?" Rosie asked. "I don't know yet. I'm going to find out." "I'll keep them calm," Rosie said, and went back to reading. Bess said. Agnes and the boy were found inside 40 minutes of serious digging in an air pocket created by a collapsed beam that had fallen at an angle. The specific bad luck that became good luck, the kind of thing the mountain gives occasionally without explanation. Agnes had a broken arm. The boy was shaken and frightened and had a cut on his forehead that bled dramatically and turned out to be shallow. Both of them were alive. 2 families from further up the slope were less fortunate in terms of their cabins. Both structures were damaged beyond immediate use, not collapsed entirely, but open to the weather in ways that couldn't be left as they were. 3 adults, 6 children between them, suddenly without shelter in April, on a mountain where the temperature still dropped to freezing at night. Beatrice had the Mercer cabin organized as a staging point within the hour. She had been in enough situations where many things needed to happen at once. 12 years of running a store with a back stockroom and a front counter and accounts that had to balance while customers had questions and deliveries arrived late. To understand that the management of simultaneous needs is not a talent exactly, but a practice, a way of looking at a situation and identifying what matters in what order and assigning the available resources accordingly. Warren Foss and his sons were best used for physical labor. May Daly's eldest was the right person to manage the transport of the displaced families down the slope. Ruth Henderson needed someone to sit with her and not talk, because she was past talking, and Beatrice put Silas's neighbor Thomas Wren with her because Thomas had the gift of useful silence. She worked the medical end herself, because she knew what she had and what it could do. The broken arm she splinted with what she had, 2 straight pieces of kindling, and the linen she'd been saving for curtains she hadn't gotten around to making, and she did it cleanly while Agnes cried and Beatrice talked to her in a steady, low voice about the kitchen garden and what was coming up and what Rosie had said that morning that was funny. Not because Agnes needed distraction exactly, but because pain is easier when there is a human voice nearby that is not panicking. Agnes's mother Ruth watched this and said nothing, which Beatrice later thought was one of the more significant silences she'd ever been in the middle of. By nightfall, the Mercer cabin held Beatrice and the two displaced families. The Henderson family was at the Daly barn, which May had lined with hay and extra blankets, and managed with the specific competence of a woman who had been running a farm alone since her husband had died 3 winters back, and had learned that situations requiring competence were not improved by waiting for someone else to provide it. Silas came and went through the cabin 4 times in the evening hours, coordinating with Warren Foss on the structural assessment of the damaged cabins, and each time he passed through the main room he scanned it. The children settled by the fire, the 2 mothers at the table with food in front of them, the thin man from the first displaced family sitting in the corner looking at nothing. And each time he looked at Beatrice across the room, and she looked back, and they did not need to say anything because there was too much happening for conversation, and also because they had been building toward a wordless fluency for months, and it was working. He brought her coffee at 9 o'clock. He put it beside her without interrupting what she was doing and went back out. She drank it without stopping. They slept in the cabin in 3 separate rooms, organized by who needed quiet and who needed company. And Beatrice slept for 4 hours on the floor of Rosie's room because the bed had a displaced child in it, and 4 hours was what the situation permitted. She didn't mind. She had slept on the floor of the store stockroom the winter her roof had needed emergency repair, and the bedroom had been uninhabitable for a week, and she had managed then and she managed now. In the morning, Rosie appeared in the doorway of her own room, looked at Beatrice on the floor with a blanket, and without a word went to the kitchen and made coffee and brought her a cup before anyone else was awake. "You learned that from him," Beatrice said. "I learned everything from both of you," Rosie said. She sat down on the floor across from her with her own cup. "Is everyone going to be all right?" "Agnes's arm will heal," Beatrice said. "The cabins can be fixed. The families don't have anywhere to be right now, but they have somewhere to be today, and that's what matters today." "What about tomorrow?" "Tomorrow has its own requirements," Beatrice said. "We'll meet them when we get there." Rosie thought about this while she drank her coffee. A small thing, this girl drinking coffee at the age of 7. But she'd started asking for it the 3rd week of March, and Beatrice had given her weak coffee with a lot of warm milk and gradually reduced the milk as Rosie had requested. And this was the result. A 7-year-old who faced difficult mornings with a cup of coffee and a practical disposition that was entirely her own, and also somehow both of theirs. "Are you tired?" Rosie asked. "Yes," Beatrice said. "You don't look tired." "I've had a lot of practice not looking it." Rosie looked at her over the rim of her cup. "Is that something you learn or something you're born with?" "Learned," Beatrice said. "Most useful things are." The town came up the mountain on Thursday. Not all of it. Red Ash Ridge was not a large place, and some of its residents would not have come regardless, but more of it than Beatrice had expected, which told her something about what the avalanche had communicated to people who lived at altitude and understood what the mountain was capable of. Calvin Rudd came with timber he'd organized from the mill. Warren Foss's wife arrived with 3 other women carrying food enough for 2 days. Pete Alderson came, which surprised her, with a team and a sledge, and the specific guilty energy of a man who has been inadequate in smaller moments and is trying to account for it in a larger one. And Nora Pitsley came. She appeared at the Mercer cabin at mid-morning with a covered pot of something that smelled like the venison stew she'd been known for since before Beatrice could remember. And she stood on the porch and looked at the organized activity in and around the cabin. The families, the children, the whole improvised structure of care that Beatrice had assembled in the last 18 hours. And her expression was doing several things at once, which was unusual for Nora, who was generally very controlled about what showed on her face. Beatrice received her at the door. "I heard," Nora said. She held out the pot. "Thank you," Beatrice said. She took it. Nora stood on the porch for a moment, the specific moment of a woman who has said things she is now reckoning with and doesn't have a clean way through to the other side. "You've been running this since it happened," Nora said. Not a question. "People needed organizing," Beatrice said. "Ruth Henderson's children were sleeping inside your cabin last night. They needed somewhere warm." Nora looked at her. "I said things," she said, "after the wedding. Things I've been told found their way back to you. Most things find their way back, Beatrice said. I was wrong, Nora said. It came out plainly, without the particular social softening that made apologies easier to give but less honest to receive. Just, I was wrong. The specific difficulty of saying it was visible on her face, and Beatrice respected her for not hiding the difficulty. Yes, Beatrice said. You were. She paused. Come inside. There are people who need feeding. Nora came inside. She did not become a different person by the end of the morning. She was still Nora Pitsley, which meant she was still managing, still opinionated, still the woman who organized her world by talking about it. But she organized the serving of food efficiently, and she spoke to Ruth Henderson with a gentleness Beatrice hadn't known she had access to. And when Agnes Foss, not Henderson, the other Agnes, Warren Foss's daughter who had come with her mother, started crying because she was overwhelmed and 7 years old, Nora sat down on the bench beside her and put an arm around her and held her without making a fuss about it. Beatrice watched this from across the room and thought, people surprise you. Not always, and not reliably. But sometimes, when the situation is large enough to require more of them than their habits allow, they find more than they thought they had. It was not a comfortable thought, exactly. It required her to hold two things at once: the real harm that small cruelties do, accumulated over years, and the real capacity of the people who do them to be something more than their worst moments. She had been holding the first thing for 40 years and was less practiced at the second. But she was finding that the second was not a requirement to forgive or forget. It was just an acknowledgement that people were not fixed quantities, that they could move, that sometimes they did. The cleanup took 3 weeks. The structural repairs to the Henderson cabin and the two others were completed in stages, with Silas coordinating the men and Beatrice managing the logistics of feeding workers and housing the displaced families in the rotating arrangements she'd organized across the Mercer cabin and the Daly barn, and eventually 2 rooms at Constance Webb's boarding house, which Constance had offered without being asked on the 3rd day and which Beatrice had accepted without making anything of the offering. The school continued through all of it. She had thought it might need to pause, too much disruption, too many children with anxious parents, too many adults with practical concerns taking precedence. But what she found instead was that the children needed it more during the disruption than before it. They needed the routine of the table and the lessons and the specific anchoring effect of learning something new in a time when everything large felt uncertain. She ran sessions in the morning while the repair work happened in the afternoon, and the attendance was higher during the 3 weeks of cleanup than it had been in the regular weeks before. Agnes Henderson came 6 days after her cabin let go, with her arm in the splint Beatrice had made, and sat at the table and did her letter work with one hand because nobody told her she couldn't, and she didn't ask. Tom Daly wrote his full name for the first time on a Wednesday afternoon in the 2nd week of May, and looked at it on the paper for a long moment, before looking up at Beatrice with an expression that a 6-year-old doesn't have the experience to name, but that she recognized perfectly. The specific private triumph of having made a thing that didn't exist before. That's yours, she said. That's your name. Nobody else's. He looked back at the paper. He traced the letters with one finger. Tom, he said. Tom, she agreed. What? It was Rosie who told her what people were calling her, and she told her the way she told most things, directly, at breakfast, while eating her bread, which was now genuinely good and had been for 2 months. People in town are calling you Mountain Mama, she said. Beatrice looked up from her coffee. Who told you that? Agnes Henderson. Her mother said it. She said the whole ridge is saying it. Rosie chewed her bread. I think it's a good name. It's a bit large, Beatrice said. You're a bit large, Rosie said. That's not a bad thing. I mean, you take up the right amount of space. You fill in the places that were empty. She said this without particular awareness that she'd said something significant, the way children sometimes do, landing on the truth sideways, without aiming for it. Beatrice sat with it for a moment. She had spent 42 years being told she took up too much space, in every sense of that phrase. She had absorbed it and worked around it and made her life in the margins it left her. And she had been, She understood now, practicing a kind of shrinking that had become so habitual she'd stopped knowing she was doing it. She was not shrinking anymore. She had not been, she realized, since she'd walked across that train platform and knelt in front of a frightened child. "All right," she said. "Mountain Mama." Rosie looked satisfied. "Papa says it fits," she said. "When did he say that?" "Last night, after you went to bed." Rosie poured herself more milk. "He said a lot of things last night. He does that sometimes. Talks when it's just the two of us and you're not there, because I think you make him want to be better than he is, and sometimes he needs to say things to someone who doesn't make him try so hard." Beatrice absorbed this complicated piece of information carefully. "What kind of things does he say?" Rosie considered how much to share with the diplomatic instinct she'd been developing lately. "He said he didn't know how to say thank you to someone for something that was too large for thank you to cover," she said. "I told him he should try anyway, because not saying things because they're too large is how people end up with things unsaid forever." She paused. "He said I was right, and then he said I sounded like you." "I'm not sure whether that's a compliment," Beatrice said. "It was," Rosie said. "He said it like it was." Silas came to find her that evening. She was in the garden, the kitchen garden that had come properly to life now in the lengthening days of late May, with things growing in the organized arrangement she and Rosie had planted in March, when the soil was still deciding whether to be cold. The chamomile was up. The kitchen herbs were establishing themselves. The 2 rows of carrots were a thin green line of promise that would take another 6 weeks at least. She heard him come. She didn't look up. He stood at the edge of the garden for a moment. She could hear him deciding something. "Beatrice," he said. She looked up. He was standing with his hands in his coat pockets and his hat off, which was the configuration she'd learned to associate with things that were serious to him. He looked like a man who has prepared something and is finding that the preparation doesn't help much when the actual moment arrives. "I need to say something," he said, "and I need to say it badly so we can get past the bad version and to the true version, because I've been trying to find the right way to say the true version, and I don't think there is one." "Okay," she said. He looked at the garden, at the carrot rows, at the chamomile, at the things growing out of the ground in the specific abundance of something that has been cared for correctly. "I asked you to be a mother for Rosie," he said. "That's what I told myself I was asking for. Someone to fill a practical need for a child who needed one." He stopped. That was honest when I said it, but it wasn't the whole of it, and I've been pretending it was because the whole of it was too large to ask a stranger for." She waited. "I needed someone who could stay," he said. "Not just with Rosie. With all of it. The place and the difficulty of it, and the way I go quiet for long stretches, and the trap line, and the long winters, and the land problems, and—" He stopped again. "I've been alone up here for 3 years, and I'd gotten used to it in the way you get used to things that aren't good for you, and I didn't know I was disappearing until you came and I started coming back." The garden was very quiet around them. A bird was doing something in the lower pines. "I'm not good at this," he said. "Saying things. You know that." "You're doing all right," she said. "I need you to know," he said, "that what you've done here, not just the avalanche, not just the school, not just Rosie, but all of it, the daily accumulation of it, it's not something I can put a name to. And I'm not going to try, because I don't want to give it a name that's too small for it." He looked at her directly. "But I want you to know that I know. What you brought up here, what it cost you, what you built out of what we had, which wasn't much." She looked at him. She thought about the train platform and the winter kitchen and the composition book with her words in Rosie's handwriting. She thought about the box on the windowsill and the table extension and 6 days instead of 7. She thought about coffee appearing beside her without being asked, in the middle of a disaster, precisely when she needed it. "It wasn't nothing," she said. "What we had." He was quiet. Something shifted in his face. Not the almost smile this time, something more settled than that. Something that had finished becoming what it was going to be. "No," he said. "It wasn't nothing." She stood up from the garden. She had dirt on her hands and her knees and her apron, which was normal. She looked at him in the evening light, this difficult, precise, slowly opening man who had walked into her store 4 months ago with his hat in his hands, and she thought that you could not have predicted this from either end of it. Not from the store and the tin cans and the town laughing, not from the train platform and the frightened girl and the thin, uncertain beginning of something that had no guarantee in it. You couldn't predict it. You could only build it, day by day, out of what was available, imperfectly, and with full knowledge that imperfect was the only kind of real there was. "Rosie says you've been talking at night," she said. "She tells you everything," he said, without apparent surprise. "She does," Beatrice agreed. "You should probably account for that in your planning." "I'll keep it in mind," he said, and he held out his hand, but not a grand gesture, not a declaration, just a hand extended in the evening light of a May garden in the mountains. And she took it, with her dirt-covered one, because it was what was available, and it was enough. The summer that followed was not simple. The school grew to 11 children by July, which meant the east wall table was no longer sufficient, and Silas began talking seriously about the lean-to structure he could add to the south side of the cabin, with its own door and its own fireplace, which would serve as a proper schoolroom in winter. He drew plans with the same quiet precision he brought to everything structural, and he showed them to Beatrice in the evenings, and she made adjustments based on what she knew about how children moved through a learning space, and he incorporated the adjustments without argument, and this back and forth, this specific practical collaboration of two people who are good at different things and trust each other to be, was one of the things she found herself most grateful for, which was not what she would have predicted in January, and was exactly right. Rosie turned 8 in June. They celebrated with the bread she'd made herself. A good loaf? Easy now. The skill accumulated past the point of effort into simple knowledge. And the venison stew Silas had been working on since Beatrice had gently suggested that trail food was not the only cooking available to him. The stew was imperfect in specific ways she could name, and she named one of them and left the rest, because you pick your corrections carefully with people who are learning. Agnes Henderson's arm healed. She wrote her full name in cursive by the end of the summer, which she could not do in April, and she came to the cabin on the last day of July and showed Beatrice with the particular charged quietness of someone presenting something they've worked very hard for and aren't sure will be recognized as the achievement it is. Beatrice recognized it. "That's clean work," she said. "You've been practicing." "Every night," Agnes said. "By the lamp." "Good," Beatrice said. "Keep doing that." Agnes went home, and Beatrice sat at the table with her teaching notes and wrote Agnes's name in the margin with a small mark beside it that meant, "This one will keep going." She had marks like that for 4 of the 11. Rosie had had the mark since the first week. Hargrove came for the final review on a morning in late August, riding the same bay horse, carrying a different notebook. He looked around the Mercer property, the garden, the south side construction in progress, the new storage structure Silas had built for the school supplies, and he went through his checklist with the same professional thoroughness, and then closed the notebook and looked at Beatrice with the particular expression of a bureaucrat who has encountered something that doesn't fit the category he'd put it in when he started. "I've done 47 of these reviews," he said, "in 12 years. "And?" she said. "And I've never closed one that felt complete," he said. He seemed slightly irritated by the word, like it had arrived before he'd approved it. "Most of them are fine. Fine is what we're looking for, what I can verify and document and file." He looked at the cabin, at the garden, at Rosie visible through the window, sitting at the table with Tom Daly on one side and Agnes on the other, showing them something on a page. "This is something past fine." "It's a working place," Beatrice said. "There's nothing finished about it." "No," he said. "I didn't say finished. I said complete." He paused. "There's a difference." She looked at him for a moment. "You're right," she said. "There is." He filed the review as fully satisfactory, no further monitoring required, and rode back down the mountain, and she stood on the porch and watched him go, and thought about completeness versus finishedness, which was a distinction worth having a name for. Rosie came to the door behind her. "Is it official?" she asked. "It's official," Beatrice said. Rosie stood beside her on the porch, looking out at the mountain the way she had started doing, with the specific proprietary attention of someone who has decided that this landscape is hers and is learning its details. The valley below was a green and brown patchwork in the late summer light. The ridge above was still snow-capped, permanent snow, the kind that didn't melt regardless of the season. "I wrote something in my book last night," Rosie said, "about you. Can I tell you what it says?" "You don't have to," Beatrice said. "I want to," Rosie said. She had the composition book, the original one, the one with the first words Beatrice had said to her on the platform, the one that had started as a book for remembering her mother and had slowly become a book for everything that mattered. She opened it to a page near the back. "Beatrice Hollow Mercer," she read, in the careful, slightly formal voice she used for things she'd written down, "came to the mountain because a little girl needed a mother. But she also came because the mountain needed someone who could see what was actually there, not what people had decided to see. She is the most capable person I know. She makes bread and teaches reading and saves people from avalanches and fixes land problems and starts schools and grows chamomile, and she does all of these things without making it look like she's doing something remarkable, because to her, they're just things that need doing, and she is the person who can do them. I used to think strength came from being the biggest or the loudest or the most beautiful. Now I know it comes from being willing to stay when staying is hard. She stayed. That is the most important fact about her." She closed the book. Beatrice looked at the valley for a moment. Then she looked at Rosie. "That's very well written," she said. "I've had a good teacher," Rosie said. "Your instincts were already good," Beatrice said. "I just gave them a direction." Silas appeared in the doorway behind them. He had flour on his hands, which meant he had been, improbably and with characteristic seriousness, attempting the bread again. He looked at the two of them on the porch and at the valley below and at whatever expression was on Beatrice's face, and he said, "What did I miss?" "Rosie was reading to me," Beatrice said. "Anything I should know about?" "Everything," Rosie said. He came and stood on the other side of Rosie, and the three of them looked at the mountain and the valley and the specific golden quality of the August light that came this way every evening for about 20 minutes before the sun dropped below the western ridge. And nobody said anything for a while because the thing that had been built here, imperfect and deliberate, and nothing like what any of them would have designed if they'd been given the choice, was larger than words at this particular moment. And they all knew it, and standing in it quietly was the most honest response available. There are things you don't find by looking for them. There are homes you don't build by planning them. There are people who see you, actually see you, past the surface and the assumptions and the long wait of being overlooked. And when you encounter one of them, you understand that you have been waiting without knowing you were waiting for exactly this. Beatrice Hollow had spent 42 years being invisible in a place that couldn't see past what she looked like. And then a man had walked into her store with his hat in his hands and asked her a question she was the only one ready to answer, and everything that followed, the difficult and imperfect and slowly beautiful everything, had come from her willingness to say yes to what was real instead of waiting for what was easy. She was still large. She was still the woman the town had overlooked for 2 decades. None of that had changed, and she didn't expect it to, because the world moved slowly in its assessments, and the mountain people of Red Ash Ridge were not exceptional in their pace. What had changed was that she had stopped waiting for the world's assessment to match her own. The valley went gold, and then amber, and then the light shifted toward evening, and inside the cabin something was burning slightly on the stove, which meant Silas's bread experiment required intervention, and Rosie smelled it first and turned and went inside with the resigned efficiency of someone whose family is a work in progress, which is the only honest kind of family there is. Beatrice followed her in. The cabin was warm and imperfect and full of the accumulated evidence of people choosing day by day to stay. That was sufficient. That was, in fact, everything.